Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable persistence of ancient Roman mysteries. Stories once explained away as legend, superstition, or the general chaos of an empire that ran an entire continent through a combination of concrete, bureaucracy, and sheer stubbornness, now unravelling under the patient, unglamorous gaze of modern archaeology. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, 2,000 years into the past, into an empire that turns out to have been solving its own mysteries in fairly relatable, occasionally ridiculous, and surprisingly human ways all along. Let's start with Roman concrete, because for centuries, engineers and historians alike were genuinely baffled by a very inconvenient fact. Ancient Roman harbours, piers and seawalls, structures that have been sitting in salt water for over 2,000 years, are in significantly better condition today than plenty of modern concrete structures built within the last 100 years, which is deeply embarrassing for modern engineering when you actually stop and think about it. Modern concrete exposed to seawater tends to crack, crumble and deteriorate within a few decades as the salt water eats away at its structure. Roman concrete, by contrast, appears to have gotten stronger over time, actively self-healing tiny cracks as seawater seeped into them, a property that sounds less like ancient engineering and more like something out of a science fiction movie. Researchers finally cracked this one open, so to speak, by examining samples of 2,000-year-old Roman marine concrete under an electron microscope, discovering rare mineral formations growing directly within the concrete's cracks, a compound called aluminous tobermarite, which formed as seawater reacted chemically with volcanic ash the Romans had deliberately mixed into their concrete recipe. Rather than fighting against the corrosive effects of salt water the way modern concrete does, Roman engineers had essentially invited the ocean in as a construction partner, allowing seawater to trigger ongoing mineral growth that continuously reinforced and healed the structure over centuries, a self-repairing building material that modern science is now scrambling to reverse engineer. Because it turns out ancient Roman builders accidentally created something considerably more advanced than anything the modern concrete industry has managed since, using nothing more sophisticated than volcanic ash, lime and seawater, mixed by hand, poured by soldiers and slaves, and left to quietly outlast every single empire that came after it. Now let's talk about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, and specifically a persistent mystery surrounding the victims of Pompeii and the neighbouring town of Herculaneum, because for a long time, historians assumed most residents died from being buried alive under falling ash and pumice, a slow, horrifying death that would have given people at least some warning to attempt an escape. Modern forensic analysis of skeletal remains, however, tells a considerably faster, and in a strange way, slightly less horrifying story. Researchers examining the bones of victims in Herculaneum discovered evidence consistent with instant extreme heat exposure, skulls with cracked bone consistent with brain matter boiling and expanding within seconds, and postures suggesting rapid muscle contraction from intense heat rather than the slow suffocation previously assumed. The current leading theory is that most victims in the immediate vicinity were killed almost instantly by what's called a pyroclastic surge, a superheated cloud of gas and ash that can reach temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius and move faster than a car on a highway, meaning many residents likely died within a fraction of a second of the cloud reaching them, essentially before their brains had time to fully register what was happening. It's a genuinely gruesome discovery, but oddly, in a strange way, less horrifying than the alternative, since it suggests thousands of people were spared a slow, conscious, agonizing death, instead experiencing something the researchers themselves described as closer to instantaneous. The famous plaster casts of Pompeii's victims, frozen in curled, defensive positions, weren't necessarily captured mid-suffering either. Some researchers now believe many of these poses may reflect the natural contraction of muscles and tendons under extreme heat, a physiological reflex rather than a final conscious act of fear, which somehow makes the whole tragedy feel simultaneously more scientifically fascinating and more quietly devastating. Let's shift to something considerably lighter, the mystery of Roman toilets, because contrary to popular belief, and contrary to what several very confidently wrong internet posts will tell you, ancient Romans did not share a single communal sponge on a stick for personal hygiene purposes, at least not in the disgusting everybody uses the same one way the internet loves to imagine. This myth largely stems from the discovery of communal public latrines throughout the Roman world. Long stone benches with rows of keyhole-shaped openings, where Romans would sit shoulder to shoulder, having what by all historical accounts was actually a fairly social experience, chatting, conducting business, occasionally even hosting philosophical debates, all while doing their business in full view of their neighbours, because privacy, as a cultural concept, meant something considerably different to ancient Romans than it does to us. Archaeologists did find sponges on sticks, called tessorium, near some of these latrines, and it's entirely possible multiple people used the same tool during a given day, which is, admittedly, still fairly unhygienic by modern standards, though recent research has pushed back on the idea that this was universal practice, pointing out that individuals may well have brought their own personal sponge, cleaned it themselves in the small channel of flowing water typically found running along the base of these latrines, specifically designed for exactly this rinsing purpose, and taken it home afterward, rather than everyone using one grim shared stick indefinitely. Either way, the real mystery isn't so much what they used, but how remarkably unbothered ancient Romans generally were about doing something we consider deeply private, in full view of an entire room of fellow citizens, chatting away about politics and gossip the entire time, which suggests that whatever social anxiety modern humans carry around bathroom privacy simply hadn't been invented yet. Here's a mystery that took genuine forensic science to crack: the death of the Emperor Claudius, long rumoured to have been poisoned by his own wife, Agrippina the Younger, allegedly using a dish of deliberately poisoned mushrooms in order to clear the path for her son, the soon-to-be notoriously unstable Emperor Nero, to inherit the throne instead of Claudius's own biological son. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Tacitus recorded this story with what reads like considerable confidence, though ancient historians, it's worth remembering, were not exactly held to modern journalistic standards, and were frequently more interested in a juicy, morally instructive story than in verified facts. Modern toxicologists examining the accounts of Claudius's symptoms, sudden violent illness following a feast, followed by a temporary recovery and then a final, fatal collapse, have suggested this pattern is actually more consistent with a specific sophisticated poisoning method than a simple one-time dose, involving an initial mushroom-based poison, possibly disguised within a genuinely poisonous species mixed among edible ones, followed by a second, more lethal dose administered later, possibly via a feather used to induce vomiting that was itself coated in poison, a detail recorded by ancient sources that sounds almost too elaborate to be fabricated. We'll never have definitive proof, since no physical evidence survives 2,000 years later, but the medical detail embedded in these ancient accounts, the specific staggered symptoms, the very particular administration method, suggests whoever originally recorded this story either had genuinely reliable insider information or accidentally stumbled into remarkably convincing forensic accuracy purely by coincidence, which would be an extraordinary coincidence indeed. Let's talk about the Roman legion that supposedly vanished without a trace, the 9th Legion, a mystery that has fueled novels, movies, and an entire cottage industry of historical speculation for decades. According to the popular version of this story, the 9th Legion marched into the mists of northern Britain sometime in the early 2nd century and simply never came back, swallowed whole by hostile Caledonian tribes in what would have been one of Rome's most humiliating military disasters, a mystery so compelling it eventually inspired the novel and film The Eagle of the Ninth. The problem, as modern historians eventually discovered while combing through actual surviving Roman records, is that this dramatic vanishing act appears to be almost entirely fictional. Inscriptions and military records show the 9th Legion was still very much active and accounted for well after its supposed disappearance in Britain, with evidence placing legionnaires from this unit stationed in the Netherlands and possibly later in the eastern regions of the Empire, suggesting the Legion wasn't wiped out dramatically in a single battle at all, but was more likely gradually redeployed, reorganised, or simply folded into other units over time, the way military units often quietly shuffle around throughout history without anyone writing an exciting story about it. The genuinely mysterious disappearance turns out to have been less a tragic massacre and more a bureaucratic paperwork trail that modern historians simply lost track of for a while, which is, admittedly, a significantly less thrilling explanation, but a good reminder that sometimes the most dramatic ancient mysteries are really just ancient record-keeping problems wearing a much more exciting costume. Now, let's discuss the Antikythera mechanism, an object so far ahead of its time that when it was first recovered from an ancient Greek shipwreck in 1901 near a small Roman-era trading vessel, researchers genuinely struggled to believe it belonged to the ancient world at all. This corroded lump of bronze, once fully analysed using modern X-ray imaging, turned out to contain over 30 precisely interlocking gears, forming what researchers now recognise as an extraordinarily sophisticated analogue computer, capable of predicting eclipses, tracking the movements of the sun, moon and known planets, and even calculating the exact timing of the ancient Olympic Games, all mechanically using nothing but carefully calculated bronze gear ratios. For decades, historians assumed nothing. This technologically advance could possibly exist for another 1,000 years after this device was built, since nothing else remotely comparable in complexity appears anywhere in the historical or archaeological record until medieval European clockwork many centuries later. It genuinely looked, to early researchers, like a piece of technology that had somehow fallen through a crack in time. The current leading theory suggests the device was likely built somewhere in the Greek world, possibly linked to the astronomer Hipparchus, or a similar school of Hellenistic scientific thought, and was being transported, likely as valuable cargo or a prized personal possession, aboard a Roman trading ship when it sank sometime around 70 to 60 BC. It represents not evidence of impossible advanced ancient technology in the alien conspiracy sense, but proof of a single, extraordinarily brilliant lineage of craftsmanship and astronomical knowledge that, tragically, appears to have been lost entirely when whatever workshop or tradition built it eventually died out, taking centuries of accumulated expertise down with it, sunk to the bottom of the Aegean Sea until a group of sponge divers stumbled onto it completely by accident, over 2,000 years later. Let's talk about gladiators next, because popular imagination, largely thanks to a certain very entertaining Russell Crowe movie, has painted gladiatorial combat as an endless parade of brutal, no-holds-barred death matches, with combatants routinely slaughtering each other for the crowd's entertainment on a near-constant basis. Modern archaeological and historical research paints a considerably more nuanced and honestly more business-minded picture. Gladiators were, in fact, an enormous financial investment, trained for years at specialised schools, fed carefully monitored diets, and treated by dedicated physicians, one of whom, fascinatingly, was a young Greek doctor named Galen, who would go on to become one of the most influential physicians in medical history, largely thanks to the surgical and anatomical knowledge he gained treating gladiator wounds. Given the sheer expense involved in training a single gladiator, most fights were actually far more regulated and considerably less lethal than popular culture suggests, with strict rules, professional referees, and specific pre-agreed conditions for when a fight would end. Analysis of gladiator skeletons recovered from a burial ground in Ephesus revealed that many combatants had healed wounds from multiple previous fights, indicating they genuinely survived numerous bouts, rather than facing certain death every single time they stepped into the arena. Death did occur, certainly, and some specific types of gladiatorial events were indeed brutally lethal by design, but the everyday reality of most gladiatorial combat more closely resembled a highly regulated, extremely dangerous professional sport, not unlike modern boxing or mixed martial arts, complete with fan favourites, celebrity status, and surprisingly detailed contracts, rather than the constant, indiscriminate bloodbath so often depicted on screen. Let's discuss the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, and the enduring legend that the Emperor Nero played a fiddle while watching his own city burn, a story so deeply embedded in popular culture that fiddling while Rome burns has become a permanent English idiom for ignoring an obvious crisis. There's just one small glaring problem with this legend. The fiddle, as an instrument, wouldn't be invented for well over 1,000 years after Nero's death, making this specific detail an anachronism so severe it would be like accusing a medieval knight of scrolling through his phone during battle. What actually happened, according to the more reliable ancient sources, is considerably murkier and considerably more sympathetic to Nero than his enduring reputation suggests. Several ancient historians, including Tacitus, who was famously no fan of Nero, actually recorded that the emperor was away from Rome entirely when the fire began, and rushed back to personally organise relief efforts, opening his own palace gardens to shelter homeless citizens and arranging for emergency food supplies to be distributed throughout the devastated city. The fiddling myth appears to have emerged later, likely fueled by a mixture of political enemies eager to tarnish his legacy and by Nero's own well-documented enthusiasm for music and performance, which, combined with his generally erratic reputation, made the fiddling story simply too irresistible not to spread. Regardless of whether it was remotely accurate, a fairly early and remarkably effective example of a smear campaign outliving the actual, more boring truth by roughly 2,000 years and counting. Let's talk about Roman roads, because their construction has long carried a certain mythical reputation for near-perfect engineering, straight lines cutting confidently across entire continents, seemingly without regard for hills, rivers, or any other inconvenient geographical obstacle daring to get in their way. For a long time, popular explanations for this insisted Roman engineers possessed some kind of nearly mystical surveying ability, an almost supernatural sense of direction, allowing them to plan routes stretching hundreds of kilometres with remarkable accuracy, long before satellites or modern mapping technology existed. The far more grounded and honestly more impressive explanation lies in a surprisingly simple device called the groma, a wooden surveying tool consisting of a vertical staff with two crossed horizontal arms, each fitted with a hanging plumb line at its ends, allowing Roman surveyors to sight straight lines and precise right angles across considerable distances by carefully aligning these hanging weights. Combined with an army of dedicated agromensors, professional Roman land surveyors who trained for years to master this deceptively simple tool, and an absolutely staggering amount of patient, methodical fieldwork, walking the actual proposed route repeatedly, adjusting for terrain, and meticulously recording measurements every step of the way, Roman engineers achieved their famously straight roads not through any mystical ability, but through relentless, unglamorous, boots-on-the-ground precision repeated over and over across an empire that eventually included over 80,000 kilometres of expertly engineered road, a network so well built that some sections remain visible, and in rare cases even usable, to this very day. Here's a genuinely eerie mystery that science recently helped resolve, involving the ancient Roman city of Pompeii and a set of skeletal remains discovered in what researchers initially assumed was a simple household setting. Among the ash-preserved remains was a skeleton found near a considerable stash of gold and silver coins, along with several precious rings, suggesting this individual had attempted, in the chaos of the eruption, to flee with as much of their wealth as possible, clutched tightly in hand, only to be overtaken by the pyroclastic surge before reaching safety, coins and treasure still gripped in their fingers even in death. What makes this particular discovery genuinely poignant, rather than simply macabre, is the broader pattern researchers have identified across dozens of similar remains throughout Pompeii and Herculaneum, ordinary people caught in their final, deeply human moments. One individual found still wearing an elaborate array of gold jewellery, likely grabbed in a desperate final attempt to save what mattered most, as the sky itself began raining ash and pumice down upon the city. These weren't posed historical reenactments or symbolic artistic representations. These were real people, 2,000 years ago, making the exact same instinctive, panicked decisions any of us might make today if given only minutes to decide what truly mattered enough to grab on the way out the door. A detail that manages to make an ancient tragedy feel startlingly, uncomfortably immediate, even after 2,000 years of distance. Let's finish with a quieter mystery, involving Roman glassmaking and specifically a stunning artefact called the Lycurgus cup, a delicate Roman drinking vessel dating back to the 4th century, which displays a genuinely bizarre optical property that puzzled scientists for decades. Viewed in ordinary daylight, the cup appears a cloudy opaque green, but when lit from behind, with light passing directly through the glass itself, the exact same cup transforms dramatically, glowing a deep, vivid ruby red, a colour-shifting effect that seemed almost impossible for ancient craftsmen working over 1,600 years ago to have achieved intentionally. Modern researchers using electron microscopy finally solved this mystery in the 1990s, discovering that Roman glassmakers had, whether through careful experimentation or fortunate accident, embedded microscopic particles of actual gold and silver ground down to particles roughly 50 nanometers in diameter, less than 1,000th the width of a human hair, directly into the glass itself. These incredibly fine metal particles interact with light in a phenomenon modern physicists now recognise as a demonstration of nanotechnology, causing the glass to selectively absorb and scatter different wavelengths of light depending on whether that light is reflecting off the surface or passing directly through it. In simple terms, Roman craftsmen were, entirely without any understanding of atomic physics or electromagnetic wave theory, working confidently at the nanoscale, producing genuine nanotechnology purely through patient generations refined trial and error, creating an effect so scientifically sophisticated that it wasn't fully explained until the very end of the 20th century, roughly 1600 years after some anonymous Roman craftsman first pulled a glowing red cup from their furnace, and, one assumes, had absolutely no idea just how impressed future scientists would eventually be. Let's talk about Julius Caesar's assassination, because while the basic facts, 23 stab wounds, delivered by a group of senators including his own trusted ally Brutus, are well documented, modern forensic analysis has actually managed to clarify some genuinely surprising details about how the attack unfolded. For centuries, most people assumed the fatal blow came from Brutus himself, largely thanks to Shakespeare immortalising the phrase et tu, brute, into permanent cultural memory. Ancient sources, however, particularly the historian Suetonius, actually recorded a somewhat different and considerably less poetic account, with contemporary physicians at the time reportedly determining that only one of the 23 wounds, a stab to the chest, was definitively fatal, while the rest, delivered by a chaotic mob of nervous, adrenaline-fueled senators who had never actually killed anyone before, were comparatively minor, several even reportedly wounding each other by accident in the confusion. This detail matters more than it might seem, because it paints a considerably less cinematic, considerably more believably human picture of the assassination, not a smooth, coordinated execution, but a genuinely chaotic, panicked mob attack, carried out largely by senators, lawyers, and career politicians who had spent their lives in the courts and the Senate chamber, not on any battlefield, fumbling through an act of violence none of them had any real practical experience performing. Modern historians studying the layout of the theatre of Pompey, where the assassination actually took place, rather than the Senate building itself as commonly assumed, have also pointed out that the enclosed, crowded space would have made a coordinated, precise attack nearly impossible, further supporting the idea that this was less a clean, decisive political execution and more a frantic, mutually panicked act of violence by a group of men who, having finally worked up the nerve to actually do the thing they'd been nervously planning for weeks, mostly seemed to be stabbing in whatever direction seemed available at the time. Let's discuss the mystery of Roman dodecahedra, small, hollow, 12-sided bronze objects, each face containing a circular hole of a different diameter, discovered scattered across former Roman territories throughout Europe, with roughly 130 examples found so far, and absolutely no surviving written record from any ancient source explaining what on earth they were actually for. This is a genuinely rare situation in Roman archaeology, since the Romans were famously meticulous record keepers, documenting everything from military campaigns to tax codes to occasionally deeply petty personal grudges against specific individuals, yet somehow left behind not a single sentence explaining these strange little objects that clearly took considerable time and metalworking skill to produce. Proposed theories over the decades have included candle holders, dice-throwing devices for a forgotten game, religious or astrological objects, military measuring instruments for calculating the range of catapults, knitting tools for producing gloves, and, inevitably, in certain corners of the internet, evidence of some kind of forgotten advanced ancient technology. None of these theories fully explains every example found, since the objects vary considerably in size, and no wear patterns, tool markings, or associated artifacts have provided a definitive answer either way. Archaeologists remain genuinely divided, and this particular mystery stands out specifically because it hasn't actually been solved yet. Unlike most of what we've covered tonight, a rare example of a Roman puzzle that has stubbornly resisted modern science's best efforts, sitting quietly in museum cases across Europe, 12-sided, faintly ridiculous-looking, and completely, infuriatingly silent about its own purpose. Let's talk about the Roman practice of vomitoriums, another wonderfully persistent myth that refuses to die no matter how many historians patiently try to correct it. Popular imagination has long insisted that wealthy Romans, during elaborate feasts, would periodically excuse themselves to a specially designated room called a vomitorium, purge their stomachs of an extravagant meal, and then return to the table to continue eating fresh courses, treating the entire dinner as an endless, gluttonous cycle of consumption and purging. It's a vivid, memorable image frequently used as shorthand for Roman excess and decadence. It is also, unfortunately for the myth, almost entirely fabricated. The actual Latin word vomitorium refers to something considerably less dramatic. The passageways built into Roman amphitheatres and stadiums, designed to allow large crowds to enter and exit quickly and efficiently, essentially an ancient architectural term for what we'd now simply call an exit tunnel, so named because the crowd would rapidly disgorge or vomit out into the streets after an event concluded, a purely architectural metaphor with nothing whatsoever to do with actual vomiting. While it's true that some wealthy Romans likely did occasionally overindulge at elaborate feasts, and ancient writers did occasionally reference incidents of excessive eating and drinking among the elite, the specific idea of a dedicated purging room built directly into private homes appears to be a much later historical misunderstanding, likely originating sometime in the 18th or 19th century, when writers apparently decided that a term describing stadium exit tunnels sounded exactly dramatic enough to repurpose as evidence of ancient Roman gluttony, and the myth simply stuck around ever since, technically incorrect, but far too entertaining for anyone to actually stop repeating it. Let's talk about the mystery of Roman concrete's cousin, the Pantheon's dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome on Earth, nearly 2,000 years after it was completed, a fact that continues to genuinely embarrass modern architects and engineers whenever they're forced to admit it out loud. For centuries, historians assumed the Romans simply got lucky, stumbling onto a workable design through trial and error rather than genuine engineering sophistication. Modern analysis has revealed something considerably more deliberate. Roman engineers gradually varied the density of the concrete used throughout the dome, employing heavier, denser materials like basalt near the base, where structural support was most critical, and progressively lighter materials, including volcanic pumice, as the dome curved upward toward its open central oculus, reducing the overall weight pressing down from above exactly where it mattered most. The dome also incorporates a series of coffers, the decorative recessed square patterns visible on its interior surface, which weren't purely aesthetic choices but functional weight reduction features, removing unnecessary mass from the structure while maintaining its overall strength. Essentially an ancient application of the same principle modern engineers use when designing lightweight aircraft frames. Combined with a precisely calculated thickness that decreases gradually from over 6 meters at the base to just over 1 meter near the top, the entire dome represents a level of structural sophistication that wasn't merely accidental trial and error, but genuinely deliberate, carefully calculated engineering, achieved without any of the mathematical tools modern architects rely on today. No calculus, no computer modelling, just centuries of accumulated practical knowledge, careful observation of which techniques succeeded and which ones collapsed, and enough patient experimentation to eventually get it exactly, perfectly right. So right that nobody has successfully built anything larger using the same unreinforced technique in the 2,000 years since. Let's discuss a genuinely strange discovery involving Roman military medicine, specifically the excavation of a Roman legionary fortress in Germany where archaeologists uncovered a surprisingly sophisticated field hospital, complete with specialized surgical instruments, evidence of successful amputations, and, most surprisingly, evidence suggesting Roman military physicians were performing procedures with survival rates that modern historians initially found hard to believe. Examination of skeletal remains from Roman military cemeteries revealed numerous examples of soldiers who had survived traumatic injuries, including successful amputations, with clear evidence of bone healing afterward, meaning these men lived for months or years following surgery that, by all rights, should have killed them through blood loss or infection alone. Roman military surgeons, it turns out, had developed a surprisingly advanced understanding of practical battlefield medicine, using bronze surgical instruments remarkably similar in basic design to their modern equivalents, employing wine and vinegar as rudimentary antiseptics long before anyone understood germ theory, and developing techniques for controlling blood loss during amputation that wouldn't be meaningfully improved upon for well over 1,000 years afterward. The Roman army, driven by the simple practical necessity of keeping as many trained, expensive soldiers alive and functional as possible, had essentially built one of the most advanced medical systems in the ancient world, not through any particular scientific breakthrough, but through sheer accumulated practical experience, treating an enormous number of battlefield injuries across an empire that was almost perpetually at war somewhere along its borders, learning through grim necessity exactly which techniques kept soldiers alive and which ones didn't. One more mystery before we let the night take over, involving the eruption of Vesuvius once again, but this time focusing on something considerably more delicate. An ancient library of scrolls buried in the nearby Villa of the Papyri, carbonized instantly by the heat of the eruption into what looked, for centuries, like nothing more than blackened, useless lumps of charcoal, too fragile to even attempt unrolling without the entire scroll crumbling instantly into dust. For roughly 200 years since their rediscovery, these scrolls sat in museum collections, tantalizingly intact in shape, containing what scholars strongly suspected was genuine, otherwise lost ancient philosophical writing, completely unreadable, a library entirely visible and entirely inaccessible at the exact same time. The breakthrough came remarkably recently, when researchers began applying a combination of high-resolution X-ray scanning and artificial intelligence pattern recognition, essentially teaching a computer to detect the incredibly subtle differences in texture between the carbonized ink and the carbonized papyrus beneath it, allowing scholars to digitally unroll and read these scrolls without ever physically touching or damaging them at all. In 2023, researchers successfully used this technique to read entire passages from a previously unreadable scroll for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, revealing text believed to be the work of an Epicurean philosopher discussing, rather fittingly, the nature of pleasure. Hundreds of additional scrolls remain in the collection, still unread, still waiting, and researchers are continuing to refine their scanning techniques, meaning an ancient Roman library, silenced instantly by a volcanic eruption nearly 2,000 years ago, is now, slowly, patiently, finally being allowed to speak again. Let's talk about the mystery of the Roman Emperor Elagabalus, one of the most colourful, chaotic and thoroughly maligned rulers in imperial history, whose actual reign has become genuinely difficult to separate from the wild exaggerations of ancient historians who despised him and had every political incentive to make him look as scandalous as humanly possible after his death. Ancient sources claim Elagabalus, who became emperor at just 14 years old, hosted dinner parties where guests were served food, made entirely of one colour to match a themed evening, released tame lions and leopards into rooms to startle unsuspecting guests, and in one particularly infamous account, allegedly smothered dinner guests under an avalanche of rose petals released from a false ceiling, a story so absurdly specific that historians have spent considerable energy debating whether it happened at all. Modern historians generally treat most of these accounts with heavy skepticism, since they were written by senators and chroniclers who had strong political motivation to paint Elagabalus as a decadent foreign-influenced disgrace, following his assassination at just 18 years old by his own Praetorian Guard, the same guard whose job was theoretically to protect him. What's genuinely fascinating and considerably more interesting than the rose petal story is that ancient sources also record Elagabalus expressing what would today be recognised as a preference for feminine dress and pronouns, reportedly telling one senator that he should be called lady rather than lord, a detail modern historians treat with considerably more seriousness and nuance than 19th century scholars once did, viewing it less as evidence of ancient decadence and more as a rare, if heavily distorted, glimpse into Roman attitudes toward gender that don't fit neatly into simple modern categories, filtered, of course, through nearly 2,000 years of hostile retelling by people who very much wanted history to remember him as a cautionary tale, rather than a complicated young ruler who died before he'd even really had the chance to become anything else. Let's discuss the mystery of Roman shipwrecks and specifically an extraordinary discovery made in the depths of the Mediterranean, where researchers found evidence that Roman sailors were transporting live fish across vast distances using specially designed ships equipped with a lead pipe running through the hull, connected to a water pump, allowing seawater to continuously circulate through a holding tank and keep fish alive for the entire journey. Essentially an ancient, remarkably sophisticated aquarium built directly into a cargo vessel. This discovery genuinely surprised marine archaeologists, since the logistics required precise plumbing, a functioning pump system, and careful maintenance throughout a journey that could last days or weeks represent a level of engineering effort that seems almost excessive for what was ultimately just fish transport, until you remember that wealthy Romans were willing to pay enormous sums for genuinely fresh seafood, particularly a specific breed of red mullet that commanded prices historians compare to modern luxury goods, sometimes selling for the equivalent of a skilled worker's entire yearly salary for a single prized fish. This level of culinary obsession extended well beyond fish. Roman aristocrats maintained elaborate private fish ponds called piscinae, some built directly into coastal villas with channels connecting them to the open sea, allowing wealthy families to raise and personally select their seafood with the same level of pride and attention modern people might apply to a prized wine collection. One senator, Quintus Hortensius, was reportedly so attached to the eels in his personal fish pond that he wept when one of them died, and allegedly wore jewellery on another, a level of aquatic pet ownership that even by ancient Roman standards struck his contemporaries as a little much, though it does suggest that whatever image we hold of stern, serious Roman senators debating matters of state all day, at least some of them were, apparently, going home to cry over their emotional support eel. Let's finish with the mystery of the so-called Roman dodecahedron's more famous, more solved cousin, the hypocaust heating system, an underfloor heating method so effective that its basic engineering principles are still used in modern radiant floor heating systems today, nearly 2,000 years later. Roman bathhouses and wealthy villas were built with raised floors supported by small brick or stone pillars called pilae, creating a hollow space underneath through which hot air, generated by a furnace called a prefernium, would circulate freely, warming the floor above and, through hollow flues built directly into the walls, warming the walls themselves as well, creating what was essentially a fully heated room using nothing but carefully directed hot air. For a long time, historians assumed this technology was reserved almost exclusively for the extremely wealthy, but ongoing excavations across the former Roman Empire from Britain to North Africa have revealed hypocaust systems in a surprisingly wide range of buildings, including public bathhouses accessible to ordinary citizens for a small fee, suggesting that even fairly average Romans, at least in urban areas, had access to indoor heating technology that wouldn't become common again in most of Europe until centuries after the fall of the empire itself. This is, in many ways, one of the more genuinely humbling Roman mysteries, not because the engineering was particularly difficult to understand once excavated, but because of just how far backward heating technology actually regressed after Rome's collapse, with medieval Europeans for centuries afterward huddling around simple open fires and drafty stone rooms, entirely unaware that their ancient predecessors had already figured out warm, comfortable, evenly heated floors, and had simply let that knowledge slip away along with so much else once the empire that maintained it finally came apart. Let's talk about the Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, a formal, officially sanctioned process of erasing a disgraced individual, usually a former emperor, entirely from public record, chiselling their name off monuments, melting down their statues, and striking their existence from official documents, essentially an ancient government-approved version of deleting someone's entire social media presence and pretending they never existed at all. This wasn't merely petty spite, though there was certainly plenty of that involved, but a genuinely serious political and religious punishment, since Romans believed that being remembered was essential to a person's legacy and, in some religious interpretations, even their peaceful afterlife, meaning erasing someone's name and image was considered a punishment that extended well beyond death itself. The Emperor Geta, who briefly co-ruled with his brother Caracalla before being murdered on Caracalla's orders, suffered one of history's most thorough damnatio memoriae campaigns, with his image scratched out of family portraits, his name chiselled from inscriptions throughout the empire, and even coins featuring his face melted down and reissued. A surviving painted portrait of the imperial family discovered in Egypt shows an oddly blank, deliberately scratched out circular smudge where Geta's face should be, a haunting, physical reminder of how thoroughly Roman political vengeance could reach, erasing a person so completely that modern historians sometimes have to piece together their existence entirely through the absence they left behind, a face-shaped hole in history where a man used to be. Let's discuss a delightfully mundane mystery involving Roman graffiti, because unlike the carefully composed speeches and formal histories that dominate most surviving Roman literature, graffiti scratched into the walls of Pompeii offers something considerably rarer: unfiltered everyday voices of ordinary Roman citizens, preserved by pure archaeological accident. Excavators have uncovered thousands of these casual scrawls, ranging from simple declarations of love to genuinely petty insults about specific named neighbours, to advertisements for local businesses, to one particularly memorable inscription reading, roughly translated, "I am amazed, O wall, that you have not fallen down, weighed under by the weight of all this tedious graffiti," essentially an ancient Roman complaining about ancient Roman graffiti, which is either deeply ironic or deeply, comfortingly human, depending entirely on your perspective. Other surviving examples include a wine shop owner cheerfully bragging about the quality of his wine, a student complaining about a particularly difficult exam, and multiple examples of election campaign endorsements, ordinary residents publicly declaring support for specific local candidates running for office, painted directly onto the sides of buildings in a system historians believe functioned as genuine grassroots political advertising nearly 2,000 years before modern campaign yard signs existed. This casual, everyday graffiti offers historians something the formal historical record almost never captures: proof that beneath the emperors, the wars, and the monumental architecture, ordinary Roman citizens were, at the end of the day, doing exactly what ordinary people have always done: falling in love, arguing with their neighbours, bragging about their local wine shop, and occasionally complaining with remarkable eloquence about how much graffiti everyone else kept leaving on the walls. Here's one final mystery before we let sleep take over completely, involving the strange sudden disappearance of an entire class of Roman luxury good, garum, an intensely flavoured fermented fish sauce that was, for centuries, one of the single most popular condiments across the entire Roman world, produced in massive dedicated factories along the Mediterranean coast, shipped in specialised amphorae throughout the empire, and used to flavour an enormous percentage of Roman dishes, roughly comparable to how ubiquitous soy sauce or ketchup might be in various modern cuisines today. And then, following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, garum production simply, almost entirely stopped, vanishing from European cuisine for well over 1,000 years, its exact recipe and production methods largely forgotten. Archaeologists excavating ancient garum factories along the Spanish and Portuguese coastlines have found enormous stone fermentation vats, and chemical residue analysis has helped modern researchers roughly reconstruct the production process, involving fish intestines, blood, and smaller whole fish, layered with salt and left to ferment under the hot Mediterranean sun for weeks or months, producing an intensely savoury, umami-rich liquid that modern food historians have compared to a distant cousin of contemporary fish sauces still used throughout Southeast Asian cooking today. Several modern chefs and historians have even attempted to recreate authentic garum using ancient recipes preserved in surviving Roman cookbooks, reporting results that, while certainly pungent, genuinely do capture something of that deep savoury flavour Romans apparently couldn't get enough of, meaning that somewhere in a very small, very dedicated corner of modern experimental cooking, ancient Roman garum has quietly, tentatively, begun making its way back onto dinner tables, nearly 1,500 years after the last authentic batch was fermented under a Mediterranean sun that has, itself, never stopped rising and setting, patiently, indifferently, the entire time. Let's talk about the mystery of the Roman baths and the surprisingly advanced water filtration and heating engineering that made cities like Bath in Britain function as genuine wellness destinations for wealthy Romans travelling from across the empire specifically to soak in naturally heated mineral springs channeled through an elaborate system of lead pipes, sluice gates, and reservoirs designed to manage water flow with a level of hydraulic precision that wouldn't be matched again in Britain for well over 1,000 years after Rome's departure. The Roman baths at Aquae Sulis, modern-day Bath, were built directly over a natural hot spring producing over 1 million litres of steaming, mineral-rich water every single day, and Roman engineers constructed an elaborate temple and bathing complex around it, complete with a sophisticated system for regulating temperature across multiple pools, from a scaldingly hot caldarium down through a moderately warm tepidarium to a bracingly cold frigidarium, allowing bathers to move progressively through different temperatures in a single, carefully designed wellness circuit. What fascinated modern archaeologists most upon excavating the site wasn't merely the engineering itself, but the sheer volume of personal offerings found discarded in the sacred spring over 12,000 Roman coins, along with dozens of small inscribed sheets of lead and pewter called curse tablets, on which visitors would scratch out formal complaints against people who had wronged them. Thieves who'd stolen their clothing or jewellery while they bathed, typically, and tossed the tablet into the spring as a kind of ancient legal petition directed at the resident goddess, requesting she personally intervene and punish the culprit. One surviving tablet reads, in a fairly representative example, roughly translated as a formal request that the goddess afflict the thief responsible for stealing a specific named bathing cloak with a total loss of sleep, memory, and intestinal function until the item is properly returned, meaning that even in a genuinely relaxing, luxurious wellness retreat, ancient Romans were still finding creative, deeply specific ways to formally curse each other over stolen laundry. Let's talk about the mystery of the missing legion's eagle standards, the sacred golden eagle emblems carried into battle by every Roman legion, treated with a reverence bordering on religious devotion, since losing your legion's eagle to enemy capture was considered one of the deepest, most catastrophic disgraces a Roman military unit could possibly suffer, sometimes resulting in the entire legion simply being disbanded afterward out of pure institutional shame. When the Roman general Varus lost 3 entire legions in the Teutoburg forest disaster of 9 AD, ambushed and annihilated by Germanic tribes in dense woodland where Roman battle formations simply couldn't function properly, the loss of those 3 legionary eagles became a genuine national wound, one that reportedly haunted the Emperor Augustus for the rest of his life, with ancient sources claiming he would occasionally bang his head against palace doorframes, crying out for Varus to give him back his legions. Rome spent years afterward launching punitive campaigns specifically aimed at recovering these lost standards, treating their retrieval as a matter of genuine national honour rather than simple military strategy. 2 of the 3 eagles were eventually recovered through subsequent campaigns led by the general Germanicus, but the fate of the 3rd eagle remained genuinely unknown for centuries, sparking centuries of speculation about whether it had been melted down, buried, or was still hidden somewhere in the German countryside. Archaeologists excavating the actual Teutoburg battlefield site only definitively located in the 1980s after nearly 2,000 years of historians arguing about its exact location, have recovered thousands of Roman military artefacts, weapons, armour fragments, coins, but the 3rd eagle standard itself has never been found, meaning somewhere in the German countryside, possibly buried under centuries of forest soil, possibly melted down by opportunistic tribespeople within days of the battle, Rome's lost eagle remains exactly what it's been for nearly 2,000 years, missing and very much still a mystery. Let's squeeze in one last one, involving the mystery of Rome's famously accurate calendar reform, undertaken by Julius Caesar himself in 46 BC. A reform so significant that the transitional year required to fix centuries of accumulated calendar drift ended up stretching to 445 days long, a single year so unusually extended that Roman writers themselves nicknamed it the last year of confusion, which is a remarkably honest piece of ancient marketing for what was, essentially, one enormous administrative headache. Before this reform, the Roman calendar had drifted badly out of alignment with the actual solar year, partly because the responsibility for periodically inserting extra days to correct the drift fell to Roman priests called pontiffs, who, it turns out, had been somewhat creatively abusing this power for their own political convenience, occasionally extending or shortening the calendar specifically to keep favoured officials in power longer or to shorten the terms of political rivals, essentially ancient calendar gerrymandering. Caesar, working with the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes, implemented a solar calendar of 365 days, with an extra day added every 4th year, a system so fundamentally sound that, with only a minor later adjustment made by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582 to correct a very slight remaining drift, it remains essentially the same calendar the entire world uses today. It's a genuinely strange thing to consider, as you drift towards sleep tonight, that the specific date on your own calendar, whatever day it happens to be wherever you're listening from, traces its structural DNA directly back to a Roman dictator, a Greek astronomer, and one extraordinarily long, deeply confusing year that Roman citizens simply had to collectively push through, one unusually endless month at a time. Think about that for a moment, as your thoughts start to slow down and blur softly at the edges. Every mystery we've wandered through tonight, self-healing concrete, an assassination bungled by nervous senators, a colour-changing cup built from accidental nanotechnology. A fish sauce industry that vanished for over 1,000 years eventually turned out to have a wonderfully human, wonderfully patient explanation hiding underneath all the ancient drama. Careful engineers testing which volcanic ash worked best. A young doctor learning anatomy from gladiator wounds. A group of anonymous craftsmen quietly perfecting a heating system that the rest of Europe would spend centuries forgetting and shivering without. Rome wasn't built by magic or mystery. It was built the slow way, the patient way, one carefully measured brick, one straight road, one long confusing calendar year at a time. There's something oddly comforting in that, isn't there? The idea that even an empire this vast, this powerful, this endlessly mythologized across 2,000 years of retelling was ultimately just built by ordinary, occasionally confused, occasionally petty, endlessly resourceful human beings, doing their best with the tools and knowledge they had, one patient day after another. There's no need to rush toward anything tonight either. Let your own thoughts settle the same unhurried way, layer by gentle layer, the way 2,000 years of history has settled quietly beneath the streets of modern Rome, unbothered, unhurried, exactly where it's always been. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey through ancient Rome, an empire that turns out to have been solving its own mysteries all along through patient engineering, careful observation, and an impressive amount of trial and error, wrapped in just enough political drama, questionable poisonings, and outright myth-making to keep historians entertained for the next 2,000 years. No fiddles, no vanished legions swallowed by fog, just remarkably determined, remarkably clever people, building an empire one straight road, one self-healing seawall, and one suspiciously convenient mushroom dish at a time. Let your eyes close now if they haven't already. Let the weight of the day settle into whatever is holding you up. There's nowhere else you need to be tonight. Somewhere beneath the modern streets of Rome, 2,000 years of history is still quietly resting in the dark, layer upon patient layer, unhurried, unbothered, exactly where it's always been. Let your own thoughts settle the same way now, layer by gentle layer, softening, quieting, drifting slowly down into rest. Rest easy tonight. And I'll see you in the next one. Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the remarkable persistence of ancient Egyptian mysteries. Stories once explained away as curses, magic, or the general spookiness of anything involving a pyramid, now unravelling under the cold, patient gaze of modern archaeology. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always nice to know who's drifting off around the world tonight. Now dim the lights. Maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, 3,500 years into the past, where a surprising number of ancient mysteries turn out to have wonderfully unglamorous explanations. Let's start with the boy king himself, Tutankhamun, a teenager who ruled for about a decade, died mysteriously young, and then spent the next 3,300 years being significantly more famous in death than he ever managed to be in life, which is either tragic or the greatest comeback story in human history, depending on how you look at it. When Howard Carter cracked open his tomb in 1922, the world lost its collective mind. Gold everywhere, a death mask so spectacular it's basically the Mona Lisa of Africa, and naturally rumours of a curse, because nothing sells newspapers like the idea that a dead teenager is personally furious you disturbed his nap. Several people connected to the excavation did die in the years afterward, which the tabloids treated as ironclad proof that ancient Egyptian magic was real and extremely petty. Lord Carnarvon, the financier of the dig, died of blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite just months after the tomb opened, and the press basically wrote his obituary as, well, he had it coming, didn't he? Never mind that Carnarvon was already in famously poor health, having survived a car accident that left him fragile for the rest of his life, and that shaving a mosquito bite with a razor while you have a weak immune system is a recipe for disaster with or without any pharaohs involved. Modern researchers, being the fun-ruining heroes they always are, eventually looked into the actual survival rates of everyone present at the tomb's opening. Turns out the vast majority of them lived long, thoroughly uncursed lives. Howard Carter himself, the man who arguably disturbed Tutankhamun more than anyone on Earth, lived another 17 years and died of lymphoma at the perfectly ordinary age of 64, which is not exactly the vengeful wrath of an angry pharaoh, so much as it is just, unfortunately, cancer. Scientists also looked into whether ancient tombs might harbour genuinely dangerous mould spores or toxic gases that could explain sudden illness in visitors. And while sealed tombs can occasionally host nasty fungal spores that irritate weakened lungs, nothing found in Tutankhamun's tomb specifically comes close to explaining a curse. The real culprit behind the myth was mostly journalism, a slow news cycle, a genuinely eerie discovery, and a public with an appetite for mummies who might reach out from beyond the grave and settle very specific scores against archaeologists with weak immune systems. So no, there was no curse. There was just a young king, an old financier with bad luck and bad health, and a press that discovered outrage sells better than incubation periods for bacterial infections. Speaking of Tutankhamun, let's talk about how he actually died, because for decades this was one of Egyptology's juiciest whodunits. Early theories suggested he was murdered, possibly bashed in the back of the head by a jealous rival, because nothing gets historians more excited than the possibility of ancient royal assassination. CT scans in the 2000s revealed a badly fractured leg, sustained shortly before death, alongside evidence of malaria in his system, which painted a much less dramatic picture. The current leading theory is that poor Tutankhamun, already weakened by a genetic disorder likely caused by generations of his family enthusiastically marrying their own relatives, broke his leg in some kind of accident, possibly falling from a chariot, and then succumbed to a nasty malarial infection that his frail inbred body simply couldn't fight off. It turns out the boy king wasn't murdered by a conspiracy of ambitious priests. He was killed by a broken leg and a mosquito, which is a monumentally less cinematic way to go, but considerably more likely, and also a pretty strong argument for expanding your dating pool beyond your own immediate family tree. Now let's wander a bit further back, to the pyramids themselves, because for a solid chunk of the 20th century, popular imagination insisted these things simply could not have been built by regular Egyptian labourers. Surely, the thinking went, you'd need aliens or Atlanteans or some lost advanced civilization with laser technology, because there's no way ancient people, using ropes and ramps and sheer stubbornness, could stack 2.3 million blocks of stone into a shape that's remained standing for 4,500 years, while most modern parking garages start crumbling after 20. This theory, charming as it is, mostly ignores the fact that we have found the actual workers' village. Archaeologists uncovered bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and the skeletons of the builders themselves near the Giza Plateau, complete with healed fractures that show they received medical care when injured, which is a strange level of hospitality to extend to enslaved alien-supervised labourers, and a very normal level of hospitality to extend to a skilled, valued professional workforce. The graffiti left behind by work gangs also survives, with teams giving themselves cheerful names like Friends of Khufu and referring to themselves with genuine pride, scrawled in red ochre on the very blocks they hauled into place. These weren't shuffling slaves under the whip of extraterrestrial overseers. They were rotating crews of farmers, conscripted during the annual Nile flood when their fields were underwater anyway, and there was, frankly, nothing better to do, fed an enormous ration of bread and beer, which functioned as both wages and, let's be honest, workplace morale. As for the engineering itself, experiments with replica ramps, sledges and wet sand to reduce friction have shown that a coordinated team of humans, using nothing more advanced than levers, ropes and a truly heroic amount of patience, absolutely could have moved and placed those blocks. It wasn't magic. It was logistics, on a scale so massive and so well organised that it makes most modern government infrastructure projects look, frankly, a little embarrassing by comparison. Let's talk about mummification next, because there's a persistent myth that the Egyptians pulled the brain out through the nose using some kind of delicate mystical procedure reserved for only the most sacred of surgical priests. The reality is significantly less elegant. Embalmers used a long metal hook inserted through the nostril and essentially whisked the brain into liquid mush, which was then drained out, tilted and discarded because the ancient Egyptians, despite their staggering achievements in architecture and astronomy, had somehow concluded that the brain was a completely useless organ, good for nothing except perhaps producing snot. The heart, by contrast, was carefully preserved and left in the body, because the Egyptians believed it was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and the soul, meaning that for thousands of years, ancient Egypt operated on the confident scientific consensus that you think with your heart and that your brain exists purely to fill space in your skull, a theory that, admittedly, checks out for a worrying number of people you may have met in your own life. This brings us to a genuinely spooky mystery that science actually did solve, which is the case of the screaming mummy. Discovered in the early 20th century among a cache of royal mummies, this particular body was found with its mouth wide open in what looks, unmistakably, like a scream frozen for 3,000 years. For decades, this fueled every horror-adjacent theory imaginable. Poisoned, buried alive, cursed by a vengeful priesthood. Egyptologists eventually nicknamed the body Unknown Man E, and speculation ran wild that he'd met some uniquely gruesome fate. Modern forensic analysis, including CT scans and genetic testing, has led many researchers to believe this mummy may actually be Prince Pentawere, son of Rameses III, who was implicated in a genuine, well-documented conspiracy to assassinate his own father in what historians now call the Harem Conspiracy, one of the most delightfully petty and violent succession disputes in the ancient world. According to surviving trial records, actual papyrus court documents from an actual ancient Egyptian legal proceeding, several of the conspirators, Prince included, were condemned to death and appear to have been forced to take their own lives, likely by poison, rather than being executed outright, possibly to preserve some shred of royal dignity for a man who just tried to murder the pharaoh. The wide-open mouth wasn't the result of a scream at all, but a side effect of what researchers now suspect was death by asphyxiation, potentially self-inflicted, with the mummification performed hastily and without the usual careful preservation techniques reserved for royalty in good standing, which would explain why the body was embalmed in rough, unscented goatskin instead of fine linen. A posthumous insult roughly equivalent to being buried in a garbage bag instead of a suit, so the screaming mummy wasn't cursed. He was a disgraced prince who tried to kill his own dad, got caught, was quietly encouraged to end his own life, and was then embalmed with all the enthusiasm of someone doing a chore they deeply resented. Let's shift to Cleopatra for a moment, because pop culture has spent centuries insisting she was the most beautiful woman who ever lived, a claim that has always rested on surprisingly little actual evidence. Surviving coins from her reign show a woman with a strong hooked nose and a fairly severe jawline, imagery she herself approved, because ancient rulers controlled their own coin portraits the way modern celebrities control their album covers. If Cleopatra had wanted to be depicted as a delicate beauty, she absolutely could have arranged that. Instead, she chose to be shown looking powerful, intelligent, and just faintly intimidating, which suggests that what actually made her legendary wasn't her looks at all, but her staggering intellect. She spoke as many as 9 or 10 languages fluently, was deeply educated in mathematics, philosophy, and rhetoric, and managed to seduce, ally with, or outmaneuver 2 of the most powerful men in the Roman world, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, not through her cheekbones, but through sheer strategic brilliance in an era that offered women essentially zero formal political power. The ancient Roman writer Plutarch, who actually had access to people who knew her, wrote that her beauty was not, in itself, incomparable, but that her charm lay in the irresistible way she spoke, the wit of her conversation, and the fascination of her presence, which is basically an ancient Roman way of saying she had main character energy long before anyone had a word for it. So the mystery of Cleopatra's legendary beauty was solved by simply reading the actual sources more carefully, and discovering that everyone was so charmed by her personality that they retroactively assumed she must have looked incredible too, when in reality she was reportedly just extremely, formidably smart, and possibly not conventionally attractive at all by ancient Roman beauty standards, which honestly should be the most encouraging piece of ancient history any of us learned tonight. Now here's one that took modern chemistry to crack. For centuries, tourists and scholars alike were baffled by the vivid, almost impossibly bright blue pigment used throughout Egyptian art, decorating tombs, statues, and jewellery in a shade so intense it seemed almost synthetic, which, as it turns out, it essentially was. Egyptian blue, as it's now called, is considered the oldest known synthetic pigment in human history, created by heating a mixture of sand, copper, and natron, a naturally occurring salt, to temperatures around 850 degrees Celsius, a process that essentially amounts to cooking up a specific crystalline compound in what was, functionally, an ancient chemistry lab disguised as a kiln. The pigment was so prized and so durable that traces of it survive on artifacts thousands of years old, still shockingly vivid, having outlasted entire empires, several religions, and roughly every paint job ever attempted on a modern house. For a long time, the exact recipe was lost, and scholars genuinely wondered whether some unique, now vanished Egyptian mineral was responsible for that colour. Modern spectroscopy analysis finally cracked it in the 20th century, revealing the compound to be calcium copper silicate, a material so oddly specific that Egyptian priests, artisans, and metallurgists effectively stumbled into materials science thousands of years before anyone had invented the concept, likely through generations of trial, error, and probably several accidentally ruined kilns before someone got the temperature and ratios exactly right. And in an amusing modern footnote, scientists have since discovered that Egyptian blue emits infrared radiation when exposed to light, a property now being explored for use in security inks, medical imaging, and even fingerprint detection, meaning a pigment invented to decorate the tomb of a long-dead pharaoh may end up helping catch modern criminals, which feels like exactly the kind of plot twist ancient Egypt would have appreciated. Let's talk about the Sphinx, because for decades, one particular detail of that enormous limestone lion drove archaeologists into fits of speculation, namely its missing nose. Popular legend, for a strange stretch of time, insisted that Napoleon's soldiers blew it off with cannon fire during his Egyptian campaign, a theory so widely repeated that it basically became accepted fact in classrooms for generations, despite the fact that sketches and written descriptions of the noseless Sphinx exist from decades, even centuries, before Napoleon was even born, meaning either Napoleon owned a working time machine, or, more likely, everyone was simply repeating a myth without checking the actual timeline. The real explanation, uncovered through medieval Arabic historical accounts, points to a 15th century Sufi Muslim, Muhammad Saim al-Dar, who reportedly took offence at local peasants worshipping the Sphinx in hopes of a good harvest, considering it an act of idolatry, and proceeded to deliberately deface the statue's nose in a fit of religious zealotry, for which he was later executed by an understandably furious local population who apparently valued their ancient monument considerably more than they valued this particular man's opinions about proper worship etiquette. So the missing nose wasn't cannon fire from a French emperor. It was an act of vandalism by one extremely committed and, in hindsight, quite short-sighted religious reformer who managed to permanently disfigure one of the most recognisable monuments on Earth, and then paid for it with his life, which feels like a fairly severe response, but also a genuinely fitting punishment for defacing something that had already been standing for roughly 4,000 years before he ever showed up. One more mystery before we start drifting towards sleep tonight, and it involves the pyramid's famously precise alignment. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy of within a tiny fraction of a degree, a level of precision that modern surveyors, armed with satellites and lasers, find genuinely impressive, and that conspiracy theorists have long taken as proof of alien intervention, because apparently ancient Egyptians measuring the stars very carefully is somehow less believable than ancient Egyptians receiving direct architectural consultation from extraterrestrial visitors. Researchers eventually proposed and tested a method involving the simultaneous observation of two circumpolar stars, tracking their rising and setting points around the celestial pole, and bisecting the angle between them to determine true north with remarkable accuracy, all achievable using nothing more advanced than a plumb line, a level surface, and an enormous amount of patient nighttime stargazing performed over the course of many, many months. The ancient Egyptians weren't just skilled builders. They were dedicated, patient astronomers who spent countless nights tracking the slow rotation of the sky, refining their measurements over and over until they achieved an alignment so precise it would embarrass most modern construction crews. All without a single power tool, GPS satellite, or friendly alien consultant. Just centuries of careful observation, mathematical curiosity, and the kind of stubborn dedication to getting something exactly right that honestly deserves a lot more credit than it usually gets. Let's talk about Hatshepsut, one of the very few women to rule ancient Egypt as a full pharaoh rather than a queen consort, and a woman who, for a solid 3,000 years, mysteriously vanished from the historical record shortly after her death, with her monuments defaced, her name chiselled out of inscriptions, and her statues systematically smashed to pieces and buried in pits, which is not exactly the kind of retirement plan most successful rulers hope for. For a long time, Egyptologists assumed this was straightforward, vindictive erasure. most likely carried out by her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, who scholars imagined must have deeply resented her, harboured decades of simmering jealousy, and finally got his revenge the moment she was safely dead and unable to argue back. It's a satisfying story, full of royal betrayal and bitter stepson energy, and for a while it was the accepted explanation taught in textbooks everywhere. Except modern research has quietly complicated this tidy narrative. For one thing, the Erasure campaign didn't actually begin until roughly 20 years after Hatshepsut's death, which is an oddly long time to nurse a grudge before finally acting on it, even by ancient royal family standards. Egyptologists now suspect the destruction wasn't personal fury at all, but a calculated, fairly boring bit of political housekeeping, an attempt to smooth over the fact that a woman had ruled as pharaoh, which threatened the traditional, exclusively male line of succession that Thutmose wanted to present as clean and uninterrupted for his own son. In other words, it likely wasn't hatred. It was branding management, ancient Egyptian style, an early and remarkably thorough exercise in rewriting the family history to make everything look tidier for future generations. Which, honestly, still happens in modern boardrooms and modern families alike, just with considerably less chiselling involved. What makes this even more interesting is that Hatshepsut's actual mummy went missing for a long stretch of history, misplaced somewhere among the jumbled royal remains, until researchers in the 2000s used CT scans and a lone tooth, matched to a specific box inscribed with her name, to finally identify her body among a group of unlabelled mummies, one of whom turned out to be a rather overweight woman in her 50s, who had suffered from diabetes and possibly bone cancer. A far cry from the youthful, glamorous pharaoh often depicted in her official statues. Though to be fair, official statues have never exactly been known for brutal honesty, in any millennium. Now let's discuss something genuinely wonderful, which is the world's first recorded labour strike, staged not by disgruntled office workers, but by the very artisans who built and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings around the reign of Rameses III roughly 3,100 years ago. These skilled craftsmen lived in a purpose-built village called Deir el-Medina, and thanks to an extraordinary volume of surviving papyrus records, we actually know an enormous amount about their daily grievances, which is either a wonderful gift to historians or a slightly horrifying reminder that workplace complaints are eternal and unkillable across all of human civilization. When their monthly grain rations, essentially their wages, were delayed, the workers simply stopped working, walked off the job site, and staged what amounts to a sit-in protest at a nearby temple, loudly and publicly declaring that they were hungry, and that this was, in fact, a problem for someone else to solve immediately. The scribes recorded the whole affair in surprising detail, including the workers' complaints, their negotiations with local officials, and the eventual, if somewhat delayed, resolution when their rations were finally delivered. This wasn't an isolated incident either. Records suggest similar work stoppages occurred more than once, meaning the pyramid builders and tomb decorators of ancient Egypt were not the silent, obedient, endlessly loyal labourers of popular imagination, but organised workers who understood their own value, knew they were skilled and difficult to replace, and were entirely willing to down their tools and make a scene the moment their basic needs weren't being met, which frankly sounds like an entirely reasonable response to not being paid then and now. Let's move to Akhenaten, arguably the strangest pharaoh in Egyptian history, a man who tried to single-handedly overthrow thousands of years of religious tradition by declaring that Egypt should worship only one god, the sun disk, Aten, rather than the enormous, sprawling pantheon of deities the culture had honoured for millennia. He built an entirely new capital city from scratch in the middle of the desert, called Akhenaten, uprooted the entire royal court to live there, and commissioned artwork depicting himself and his family in a strikingly unusual, almost alien style, with elongated skulls, wide hips, and soft, almost feminine features, a dramatic departure from the idealized. Muscular imagery every pharaoh before him had insisted upon. For decades this fueled wild speculation, including genuinely popular theories that Akhenaten suffered from a rare genetic disorder, or, in the more enthusiastic corners of the internet, that he might have literally been an alien, because apparently any unusual artistic choice in ancient Egypt eventually gets attributed to extraterrestrials by somebody. The more grounded explanation, supported by most modern Egyptologists, is that the elongated, androgynous artistic style was a deliberate religious and political statement, portraying the royal family as divine, otherworldly, almost genderless beings who existed somewhere between human and God, a visual argument for exactly the kind of unprecedented religious authority Akhenaten was trying to claim for himself. As for his health, genetic testing conducted on his mummy, tentatively identified through DNA comparison with known relatives, revealed evidence consistent with several inherited disorders, unsurprising given that Egyptian royal families frequently, enthusiastically, and repeatedly married their own siblings and cousins in an effort to keep bloodlines pure, a strategy that, biologically speaking, tends to produce the exact opposite of purity over successive generations. After Akhenaten's death, his religious revolution collapsed almost immediately. His own son, a young boy you might recognise by the name Tutankhamun, was quickly steered back toward the traditional gods by the priesthood. His father's new capital was abandoned to the sand, and Akhenaten's name was largely scrubbed from official records, treated by later generations as an embarrassing heretic best forgotten entirely, which, ironically, is exactly how most of us learned about him thousands of years later anyway. Here's a puzzle that took modern linguists decades to crack. For centuries after the fall of ancient Egypt, absolutely nobody could read hieroglyphics. The knowledge simply died out generation by generation until an entire language, an entire system of writing that had recorded thousands of years of history, religion, and daily gossip became a complete and total mystery. A wall of beautiful, indecipherable symbols that scholars could stare at for hours without understanding a single word. The breakthrough came in 1799, when French soldiers stumbled upon a broken slab of black granite near the town of Rosetta, inscribed with the same text written 3 separate times, in hieroglyphics, in a simpler Egyptian script called Demotic, and in ancient Greek, a language scholars could already read fluently. It still took over 2 decades of painstaking work before a French linguist named Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code in 1822, realizing that hieroglyphics weren't purely symbolic pictures, as everyone had assumed, but a complex mixture of phonetic sounds and symbolic meaning, essentially an ancient alphabet disguised as elaborate art. His breakthrough moment reportedly came while examining a cartouche, a royal name enclosed in an oval, and recognizing the phonetic sounds that spelled out remesses, at which point he supposedly ran through the streets of Paris shouting that he had figured it out, before promptly collapsing from exhaustion and excitement, which feels like an entirely reasonable response to single-handedly unlocking 3,000 years of silenced history in one dramatic afternoon. Let's finish with a smaller, quieter mystery, one that has less to do with royalty and more to do with everyday Egyptian medicine, because ancient Egyptian doctors were in many ways startlingly advanced for their time, performing surgeries, setting broken bones, and even attempting rudimentary dental work, all documented in surviving medical papyri that read like genuinely competent clinical notes. But they also, somewhat charmingly, believed that many illnesses were caused by unhappy spirits or invading demons lodged inside the body, meaning a typical Egyptian medical treatment might involve a perfectly reasonable herbal remedy for pain, followed immediately by a spoken spell intended to politely but firmly ask the offending demon to leave. Modern researchers examining these medical texts have found genuinely effective treatments buried among the spells, including honey used as an early antibacterial wound dressing, willow bark chewed for pain relief, centuries before anyone isolated the aspirin-like compound hiding inside it, and mouldy bread applied to infected wounds, an early accidental brush with the same antibacterial properties that would eventually lead to the discovery of penicillin thousands of years later. The Egyptians didn't understand germ theory, obviously, and had no concept of bacteria or infection in the way modern medicine does, but through generations of careful trial and error, they stumbled onto remedies that genuinely worked, wrapped the whole practice in comforting religious ritual to make sense of why some treatments succeeded and others failed, and left behind medical records so detailed that modern doctors can still, occasionally, learn something useful from a 4,000-year-old scroll. Let's talk about Tutankhamun's dagger, because this one genuinely baffled scientists for decades. Among the treasures found in his tomb was a beautifully preserved iron dagger, remarkable not just for its craftsmanship but for the simple fact that it hadn't rusted at all after more than 3,000 years underground, which is deeply unusual since iron artifacts from this era almost always corrode into crumbling rust-flaked messes given enough centuries. Even stranger, ancient Egypt was still firmly in the Bronze Age when Tutankhamun died, meaning iron-working technology, as far as anyone could tell, simply didn't exist yet in the region. raising the obvious question of where exactly a Bronze Age teenager got his hands on a perfectly forged iron blade. Modern spectroscopy analysis finally solved the mystery in 2016, revealing that the dagger's composition matched meteoric iron almost perfectly, meaning this blade was forged not from mined ore, but from a chunk of an actual meteorite that fell from space and was collected, likely with tremendous reverence, by Egyptian metalworkers who understood, correctly, that this material was extraordinarily rare and worth an enormous amount of careful craftsmanship. The ancient Egyptians even had a specific hieroglyphic phrase that translates roughly to iron of the sky, suggesting they were fully aware this metal came from somewhere far above their heads, long before anyone had the faintest scientific concept of what a meteorite actually was. So Tutankhamun wasn't buried with some impossible piece of advanced alien technology, as certain corners of the internet still insist. He was buried with a dagger made from a genuine piece of outer space, hammered into shape by extremely skilled craftsmen who correctly recognised that falling space rocks made for excellent, rust-resistant blades, which honestly might be cooler than the alien theory anyway. Now the Great Sphinx, and specifically, the enduring question of exactly who built it and when, because unlike most Egyptian monuments, the Sphinx conveniently forgot to leave behind any inscriptions clearly stating who commissioned it, leaving Egyptologists to argue about its origins for well over a century. The most widely accepted theory credits the pharaoh Khafre, builder of the second largest pyramid at Giza, largely because the Sphinx's face is believed to resemble known statues of him, and because it sits directly along a causeway connecting to his pyramid complex, which is a fairly reasonable bit of circumstantial evidence, similar to concluding someone lives in a house because you found their car parked directly in the driveway. A small but vocal group of researchers has pushed back against this, pointing to unusual weathering patterns on the Sphinx's body, deep vertical fissures that some geologists argue look distinctly like the kind of erosion caused by heavy rainfall, rather than the wind and sand erosion you'd expect in Egypt's current desert climate, suggesting the monument might actually be thousands of years older than the Khafre theory allows, dating back to a wetter period in the region's ancient history. This idea, sometimes called the Sphinx water erosion hypothesis, remains controversial and is not accepted by most mainstream Egyptologists, who point out that the geology of the Giza Plateau is complicated enough that alternative, less dramatic explanations for the weathering pattern exist, involving softer layers of limestone eroding differently than harder layers stacked right above them. The debate hasn't been definitively settled either way, which means the Sphinx, appropriately enough for a creature whose entire mythological purpose was posing unanswerable riddles, continues to guard its own origin story rather jealously, even after 4,500 years of people trying to pry the answer out of it. Let's talk about cats for a moment, because ancient Egypt's relationship with cats has become something of an internet legend, usually summarised as ancient Egyptians worshipped cats, which is true, but only tells part of a considerably stranger story. Cats were indeed sacred, associated with the goddess Bastet, and harming one, even accidentally, could apparently provoke serious public outrage. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded, with what reads like genuine astonishment, that Egyptian families would shave off their eyebrows in mourning when a household cat died naturally, and that killing a cat, even by accident, could result in the offender being torn apart by a furious mob, which is an escalation in consequences that modern pet owners can only dream of. But here's the part that surprises people. Archaeologists have uncovered enormous animal cemeteries containing millions of mummified cats, and for a long time this was interpreted purely as evidence of tender religious devotion, tiny beloved pets carefully preserved for the afterlife. Modern X-ray and CT scan analysis of these mummies revealed something considerably more unsettling. A large percentage of these cats show signs of having their necks deliberately broken at a young age, some as young as a few months old, strongly suggesting they were being bred specifically, in what amounted to industrial quantities, purely to be killed and mummified as religious offerings sold to pilgrims visiting temples. Essentially, an ancient devotional gift shop economy built on kittens. It's a genuinely uncomfortable contrast. A culture capable of both fierce, sincere reverence for cats as sacred beings, and simultaneously running what modern researchers now recognise as organised mass breeding and ritual slaughter operations to meet religious tourism demand, proving once again that human beings have always been magnificently, uncomfortably complicated even 4,000 years ago. Let's discuss Cleopatra's actual death, because the popular image, a snake bite from an asp pressed dramatically to her breast, has been quietly challenged by historians for years. The ancient sources themselves, written decades after her death by Roman writers who had every political incentive to make her downfall as scandalous and theatrical as possible, disagree on several key details, including exactly how the snake was introduced, whether there even was a snake at all, and whether she died alone or alongside her attendants. Modern toxicologists have pointed out a few inconvenient problems with the traditional story. Cobra venom, the most likely candidate snake in ancient Egypt, doesn't typically produce a quick, peaceful death. It tends to cause prolonged, visibly painful symptoms, vomiting, paralysis spreading slowly through the body, which doesn't quite match the ancient descriptions of Cleopatra, found looking serene and composed, as though she'd simply fallen asleep. Some researchers now suspect Cleopatra, who was famously knowledgeable about poisons, having reportedly tested their effects on condemned prisoners out of scholarly curiosity, may have instead used a carefully prepared mixture of toxic substances, possibly including hemlock, wolfsbane, and opium, a combination that historical accounts suggest could produce a swifter, more dignified death than a snakebite ever could. We may never know for certain, since no physical evidence survives to test, and her tomb itself has never been definitively located, despite ongoing excavations along the Egyptian coast searching for it to this day. What we do know is that the entire snake story was politically convenient for Rome, allowing Augustus to frame Cleopatra's suicide as a wild, exotic, almost theatrical act befitting a foreign queen, rather than the calculated, deliberate final decision of a formidably intelligent woman choosing exactly how her own story would end. One last mystery before we let the night carry us off completely, and it involves the Lighthouse of Alexandria, once counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A structure so massive and so advanced for its time that ancient writers described it standing well over 100 meters tall, using polished mirrors to reflect sunlight during the day and a blazing fire at night, visible to ships from an almost unbelievable distance out at sea. For centuries, its exact appearance remained mysterious, known only through ancient descriptions, mosaics, and coins, since a series of earthquakes between the 12th and 14th centuries gradually toppled the structure into the harbour, where its remains sat scattered on the seafloor, forgotten for roughly 600 years. Marine archaeologists finally began recovering pieces of the lighthouse in the 1990s, diving into Alexandria's harbour and discovering massive granite blocks, statues, and architectural fragments, some weighing over 70 tons, still recognisable after centuries underwater, allowing researchers to finally begin reconstructing an accurate picture of what this legendary structure actually looked like, confirming many ancient descriptions while correcting others. The lighthouse's exact mechanism for its reflective mirror system remains only partially understood, since no complete mirror mechanism survived intact, but the sheer scale of the recovered stonework confirms that ancient accounts, often dismissed by later skeptics as wild exaggeration, were, if anything, fairly restrained descriptions of a genuinely enormous piece of engineering sitting quietly on the harbour floor for 6 centuries, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. Let's talk about a mystery that's still, quite literally, unfolding, involving a massive hidden void discovered inside the Great Pyramid itself in 2017, found not with picks and shovels but with subatomic particles, which is a sentence that would have made absolutely no sense to anyone involved in ancient Egyptian construction. A team of international scientists used a technique called muon tomography, essentially detecting the faint shadows cast by cosmic ray particles as they pass through solid stone, to scan the pyramid's interior without drilling a single hole. And what they found was a previously unknown chamber, roughly 30 meters long, situated directly above the pyramid's famous Grand Gallery, a space that had sat completely sealed and undisturbed for over 4,500 years. The internet, predictably, lost its mind almost immediately, with wild speculation ranging from secret treasure chambers to hidden alien technology, to some kind of ancient control room, because apparently no unexplained space inside a pyramid can simply be, well, an unexplained space. The more grounded explanation offered by Egyptologists is that this void was likely left deliberately during construction, either as a structural relief chamber designed to redistribute the pyramid's enormous weight away from the ceiling of the grand gallery below, or possibly as an unfinished abandoned section of the original construction plan that builders simply sealed up and moved past. As of now, nobody has managed to physically enter the space, since doing so would require drilling into one of the most significant archaeological structures on the planet, an act that tends to require considerably more paperwork and international debate than your average home renovation. So for now, the chamber remains exactly what it's been for over 4,000 years, sealed, silent, and stubbornly refusing to explain itself. Let's discuss the famous bust of Nefertiti, arguably one of the most recognisable faces from the ancient world, currently sitting in a museum in Berlin and the subject of a surprisingly bitter, decades-long international dispute. The bust was discovered by German archaeologists in 1912 at the site of Akhenaten's abandoned capital city, and shipped back to Germany shortly afterward, under circumstances that Egypt has argued, with considerable justification, were misleading at best. According to Egyptian officials, the German excavation team deliberately downplayed the quality and significance of the piece during the legally required division of artefacts between the excavators and the Egyptian government, essentially describing one of the most exquisite pieces of ancient portraiture ever discovered as a fairly unremarkable plaster bust, allowing them to walk away with it legally while grossly misrepresenting what they'd actually found. Egypt has formally requested the bust's return multiple times over the past century, arguments that have, so far, gone nowhere, with German museum officials citing the original legal export documentation and expressing understandable reluctance to set what would become an enormously significant precedent for returning contested artefacts. The bust itself, meanwhile, remains an object of genuine mystery in its own right. One of Nefertiti's eyes is missing its inlay, and nobody knows for certain whether this was an intentional artistic choice by the original sculptor, perhaps representing an unfinished practice piece rather than a final artwork, or whether the inlay simply fell out and was lost sometime over the last 3,300 years, a detail that feels almost fittingly mysterious for a queen whose entire life remains frustratingly underdocumented compared to her husband's dramatic religious revolution. Here's a smaller, gentler mystery to ease us further towards sleep, involving something found in nearly every well-furnished ancient Egyptian tomb. A board game called Senet, essentially an ancestor of modern board games, played on a grid of 30 squares with pieces moved according to throws of casting sticks or knuckle bones, functioning as a kind of very early dice. For a long time, scholars weren't entirely sure of the exact rules, since no complete ancient rulebook survives, only the boards themselves and scattered references in art and religious texts, leaving modern researchers to reconstruct the gameplay through educated guesswork. Similar to trying to figure out the complete rules of chess using only a handful of surviving chessboards and absolutely no rulebook whatsoever. What made Senet particularly fascinating to Egyptologists wasn't just the game mechanics, but the fact that it eventually evolved into something with genuine religious significance, believed by later periods of Egyptian history to represent a symbolic journey through the afterlife, with certain squares on the board associated with specific spiritual dangers or blessings a soul might encounter after death. Tomb paintings show the deceased playing Senet against an invisible opponent, believed to represent either fate itself or a spiritual guide, with a successful game symbolically ensuring safe passage into the afterlife, transforming what began as, essentially, an ordinary board game night activity into a deeply serious spiritual metaphor, played out with wooden pieces and ivory dice by people trying to secure a peaceful eternity, one careful move at a time. Let's finish with the mystery of the solar boats, enormous, fully functional wooden ships discovered buried in pits directly beside the Great Pyramid, dismantled into over 1,200 separate pieces and packed away with such extraordinary care that when archaeologists finally reconstructed the largest one in the 1950s, it turned out to be a genuinely seaworthy vessel over 40 metres long, built from imported cedar wood and assembled using a sophisticated rope lashing technique rather than nails, a construction method so effective that when researchers eventually built a scale replica and tested it on water, it performed beautifully, gliding smoothly despite having no metal fastenings whatsoever holding it together. The purpose of these buried boats remains genuinely debated among Egyptologists. Some believe they were intended as literal funerary vessels, meant to carry the pharaoh's soul across the sky alongside the sun god Ra on his eternal daily journey. A purely symbolic, spiritual boat never meant to touch actual water. Others point to subtle water stains and wear patterns found on the wood, suggesting this particular vessel may have actually been used at least once, perhaps even to ferry the pharaoh's body itself down the Nile during his funeral procession, before being ceremonially dismantled and sealed away for eternity. Either way, the sheer care taken in its construction and burial, cedar imported from distant Lebanon, joints so precisely fitted that the boat needed no metal at all, tells us something genuinely moving about how ancient Egyptians thought about death, not as an ending, but as the beginning of one final, carefully planned journey, one they wanted their pharaoh to make in real, actual, functioning style. Let's talk about an entire city that simply vanished, swallowed whole beneath the Mediterranean Sea, and remained lost for over 1,000 years until it was accidentally rediscovered. Thonis Heracleion was once a thriving Egyptian port city, mentioned in ancient Greek texts and believed by many historians for centuries to be purely legendary, a kind of Egyptian answer to Atlantis, until French underwater archaeologist Frank Godiot and his team stumbled upon its ruins in the year 2000, buried under several metres of silt and seawater in Abukir Bay, roughly 6.5 kilometres off Egypt's northern coast. What they found down there was staggering. Enormous temple foundations, colossal statues over 5 metres tall depicting gods and pharaohs, hundreds of smaller statuettes, dozens of ancient shipwrecks perfectly preserved in the low-oxygen mud, and coins, jewellery and everyday household items scattered across the seafloor. Essentially an entire ancient city frozen in place at the exact moment it slipped beneath the waves. Geological analysis suggests the city sank gradually, rather than in one single dramatic catastrophe, likely due to a combination of factors including rising sea levels, soil liquefaction caused by the weight of its own massive stone buildings sitting on unstable, waterlogged clay, and possibly a series of earthquakes and tsunamis that struck the region over the centuries, slowly, patiently, pulling the entire city down into the sea inch by inch, over a process that likely played out across several hundred years rather than happening all at once. Divers have since recovered a large stone slab nearly intact, inscribed with a decree from the pharaoh Nectanebo I, containing tax regulations for goods passing through the port, proving beyond doubt that this genuinely was the once mythical city ancient Greek historians had written about, not legend at all, but simply forgotten, sitting quietly on the seafloor for well over 1,000 years while the world above moved on entirely, empires rising and falling, without anyone realising an entire ancient city was resting peacefully beneath the waves the whole time, waiting for someone to finally come looking. Let's end with something wonderfully mundane ancient Egyptian beer, because it turns out this beverage wasn't merely a casual drink, but functioned as an actual form of currency, an essential part of daily wages, and quite possibly one of the most important nutritional staples in the entire ancient Egyptian diet, consumed by everyone from lowly labourers to the pharaoh himself. Workers building the pyramids received a daily ration that included substantial quantities of bread and beer, not as some kind of ancient workplace happy hour perk, but as their literal payment, meaning the pyramids of Giza were, in a very real sense, built by a workforce running almost entirely on carbohydrates and mild alcohol, which either explains a great deal about ancient productivity, or simply confirms that humans have always understood the fundamental economic principle that people work harder when properly fed and reasonably content. This beer bore almost no resemblance to anything you'd find at a modern brewery. It was thick, porridge-like, only mildly alcoholic, and brewed from partially baked bread loaves crumbled into water and left to ferment naturally with wild yeast, making it more of a nutritious, calorie-dense meal replacement than a recreational drink, packed with vitamins, minerals, and enough calories to genuinely sustain someone through an entire grueling day of hauling limestone blocks across the desert. Modern archaeologists and brewers have actually recreated ancient Egyptian beer recipes using residue analysis from pottery jars, and by most accounts, it tastes exactly as you'd expect something described as porridge that fell into a river to taste, which is to say an acquired taste at best, but a genuinely revolutionary piece of ancient nutritional engineering that helped feed the workforce behind some of the most enduring structures human beings have ever built. One thick, lukewarm, slightly fizzy jar at a time. One final small mystery before we let sleep take over completely, and it involves something you wouldn't necessarily expect from a civilization this advanced. Remarkably terrible teeth, even among pharaohs who otherwise enjoyed every luxury imaginable. Examinations of royal mummies have revealed widespread dental problems, severe wear, abscesses and cavities, conditions you might expect from poverty and poor nutrition, not from rulers with access to the finest food in the entire kingdom. For a while this puzzled researchers, until closer analysis of ancient Egyptian bread revealed the culprit hiding in plain sight, quite literally, in the flour itself. Egyptian grain was ground using stone querns, and tiny particles of that stone, along with wind-blown desert sand that inevitably settled into the flour during processing, ended up baked directly into every single loaf of bread, meaning that every meal, for pharaoh and peasant alike, came with a small, unavoidable side serving of grit. Over the course of an entire lifetime spent eating essentially sandy bread with every meal, this constant abrasion wore down tooth enamel dramatically, exposing sensitive inner tooth layers to infection and decay, regardless of how wealthy or well cared for you otherwise were. Even Ramesses the Great, arguably the most powerful pharaoh in Egyptian history, ruler of an empire, builder of colossal monuments, suffered from severe dental abscesses so painful that some researchers believe they may have genuinely contributed to his eventual death in his early 90s, meaning the greatest warrior pharaoh in Egyptian history was in the end quite possibly taken down not by rival armies or conspiracy, but by a lifetime of gritty bread and the complete absence of dentistry as we understand it today, which feels like an oddly humbling note to end on, but also, somehow, a deeply comforting reminder that even the mightiest rulers in human history occasionally lost sleep over nothing more dramatic than a nagging toothache. Let's talk about the Dendera light, one of the internet's absolute favourite pieces of ancient Egyptian conspiracy fuel, a carved stone relief found in the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, depicting what enthusiasts insist looks suspiciously like a giant light bulb, complete with a curved bulb shape, a filament, and even something resembling an electrical cable running along the bottom, leading to genuinely popular theories that ancient Egyptians secretly possessed electric lighting technology thousands of years before Edison. Technology that was then, for reasons nobody has ever satisfactorily explained, completely forgotten and never used again anywhere else in the ancient world. Egyptologists, upon actually reading the accompanying hieroglyphic inscriptions rather than just staring dramatically at the image, identified the carving as a fairly standard piece of Egyptian religious symbolism, depicting a lotus flower from which a snake emerges, resting inside what's interpreted as a representation of the sky or the primordial waters of creation, a scene that closely matches other confirmed Egyptian creation mythology found throughout similar temples, with the snake symbolizing transformation and rebirth, rather than, somewhat less poetically, a tungsten filament. The supposed cable, researchers point out, is actually a stylized djed pillar, a common Egyptian symbol representing stability, appearing in hundreds of other confirmed religious carvings throughout Egyptian art with absolutely no electrical connotations whatsoever. There's also the small, but fairly significant problem that if ancient Egyptians genuinely had working electric lighting, archaeologists would reasonably expect to find at least some supporting evidence somewhere else, across the thousands of tombs, temples and settlements excavated throughout the region. Wiring, batteries, evidence of power generation, literally anything, rather than one single carving in one single temple that conveniently requires ignoring its own hieroglyphic caption to interpret as futuristic technology. The truly fascinating part of this story isn't the light bulb theory itself, but the fact that ancient Egyptian religious symbolism, layered, complex, and often genuinely strange to modern eyes, is apparently more comfortable being explained away as forgotten alien technology than simply appreciated as what it actually is, a beautifully carved, deeply meaningful piece of 3,000-year-old spiritual storytelling that has absolutely nothing to do with electricity and everything to do with snakes, flowers, and the eternal cycle of creation. Let's squeeze in one more before we drift off, because it's a good one. For a long time, historians genuinely debated whether Egypt's very first pharaoh, a man named Nama who supposedly unified Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom around 3,100 years before the Common Era, was an actual historical person at all, or simply a symbolic, half-mythical figure invented later to explain and justify the unification of the two kingdoms after the fact, in much the same way certain founding legends get exaggerated or entirely invented long after a country's actual messier origins. The main piece of evidence was a single ceremonial slate object called the Nama palette, an intricately carved stone slab depicting a king wearing the crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the crown of Lower Egypt on the other, smiting enemies and generally looking like someone who has just had an extremely successful and violent afternoon. For decades, this was essentially the only solid evidence of Nama's existence, leading some scholars to argue he might represent multiple real rulers combined into a single symbolic figure for storytelling convenience, rather than one actual specific man. The mystery began settling once archaeologists found his name inscribed at multiple additional sites across Egypt, including pottery, ivory labels and tomb inscriptions found at Abydos, strongly suggesting he was indeed a real historical ruler rather than a symbolic invention, one whose reign genuinely did mark a turning point where Egypt shifted from a collection of smaller competing territories into the beginnings of the long, unified civilization we've spent the last hour wandering through. Most Egyptologists today accept Nama as a real historical figure, quite possibly the very first person in recorded history to rule over a unified nation-state, which is a genuinely enormous historical footnote for a man whose entire surviving legacy largely comes down to one very dramatic, very well-preserved ceremonial slab of stone. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey through ancient Egypt, a civilization that turns out to have solved most of its own mysteries the old-fashioned way, through careful observation, patient trial and error, genuine engineering brilliance, and, occasionally, some truly petty family drama that would not feel out of place in any modern soap opera. No curses, no aliens, no lost technology, just remarkably clever, remarkably human people, doing remarkable things over thousands of patient years, one carefully placed stone block at a time. Think about that for just a moment as your own thoughts start to soften and blur at the edges. Every single mystery we've wandered through tonight, the curse that wasn't, the murder that wasn't, the alien technology that wasn't, eventually turned out to have a wonderfully human explanation underneath all the drama. A mosquito bite, a broken leg, a jealous stepson smoothing over the family history, a meteorite hammered patiently into a blade, grit baked into bread. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? How often the strangest, spookiest, most impossible-sounding mysteries turn out to have such quiet, ordinary answers waiting underneath. Once someone finally takes the time to look closely enough, carefully enough, patiently enough. That patience is really the whole story of ancient Egypt, isn't it? Thousands of years of people who had no rush anywhere, who tracked stars for months just to align a single building, who spent entire careers slowly chipping away at solid granite one small tool mark at a time, who buried their dead with boats they'd never sail and games they'd never finish playing, trusting that someone, someday, far off in a future they couldn't possibly imagine, might understand what they'd left behind. There's no need to hurry through anything tonight either. Let your breathing slow down to match that same unhurried pace. Let your thoughts settle the way sand settles over centuries, layer by gentle layer, until there's nothing left but stillness and quiet and the soft, patient dark. Let your eyes close now if they haven't already. Let the weight of the day sink into whatever is holding you up. There's nowhere else you need to be. The pyramids have been standing for 4,500 years, and they'll still be standing tomorrow long after you've drifted off. Somewhere in the quiet dark of the Giza Plateau, the stars are wheeling slowly overhead. The same stars that ancient astronomers once tracked night after patient night. And there's no reason you can't let your own thoughts wheel just as slowly now. Drifting, settling, softening, the way sand settles after thousands of years of wind. Rest easy tonight, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable persistence of Viking mysteries. Stories once explained away as horned helmets, endless pillaging, and general seafaring chaos, now unravelling under the patient, unglamorous gaze of modern archaeology, and turning out to be considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than the popular image ever gave them credit for. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, back roughly 1,000 years, into the cold northern waters of Scandinavia, where a surprising number of ancient mysteries turn out to have wonderfully unglamorous and occasionally wonderfully weird explanations. Let's start with the horned helmets, because this is quite possibly the single most persistent, most widely believed, and most thoroughly, completely wrong piece of Viking imagery in all of popular culture. Ask virtually anyone to picture a Viking warrior, and they'll almost certainly imagine a burly bearded man charging into battle wearing a metal helmet topped with two enormous curved horns, an image so deeply embedded in movies, cartoons, sports team mascots and opera costumes that it feels less like a historical claim and more like an unquestionable fact of nature. Archaeologists, having excavated hundreds of genuine Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia, have found precisely 0 horned helmets from the actual Viking period. A fairly significant problem for a piece of headgear that's supposedly their defining characteristic. The genuine Viking helmets that have survived, and there really aren't many since most were made of leather or simple iron that rarely preserves well over 1,000 years, show plain, practical, rounded designs, sometimes with a simple nose guard built entirely for protection rather than dramatic flair, which makes a great deal of practical sense, since attaching 2 enormous curved horns to your helmet in actual hand-to-hand combat would mainly serve to give your opponent something convenient to grab onto and yank your head straight off balance. So where did this myth even come from? The blame largely falls on a 19th century Swedish costume designer named Carl Emil Dupler, who created horned helmet costumes for an 1876 production of Wagner's opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen, drawing loosely on earlier, genuinely ancient but considerably older Bronze Age ceremonial helmets that predate the actual Viking Age by well over 1,000 years, and had absolutely nothing to do with actual Viking warriors at all. The image proved so visually striking that it stuck permanently in popular imagination, meaning the entire modern concept of horned Viking helmets essentially traces back to one enthusiastic opera costume designer working on a fantasy production roughly 800 years after the actual Viking Age had already ended. Now let's talk about berserkers, the legendary Viking warriors said to have fought in a wild, uncontrollable trance-like fury, supposedly biting their own shields, howling like animals, and charging into battle with such reckless, superhuman rage that neither fire nor iron could stop them, according to the more excitable ancient sagas. For centuries, historians debated whether this was pure literary exaggeration, or whether something genuinely unusual was happening to certain Viking warriors before combat, and modern researchers have proposed several fascinating, if still debated, explanations. One popular theory suggests berserkers may have deliberately consumed large quantities of the hallucinogenic mushroom Amanita muscaria, the classic red and white spotted toadstool instantly recognisable from countless fairy tale illustrations, which can produce symptoms including heightened aggression, reduced pain sensitivity, and a kind of frenzied, disoriented energy. Though this theory remains genuinely contested among historians, since no direct archaeological or written evidence definitively confirms mushroom use specifically among berserker warriors. An alternative, somewhat less dramatic theory proposes that berserkers may have simply worked themselves into a state of genuine self-induced hysteria through ritual, chanting and psychological preparation, essentially an extremely intense pre-battle pep talk taken to its most extreme possible conclusion, a state modern psychologists might recognise as similar to certain documented trance states achieved through prolonged ritualistic behaviour, rather than any external substance at all. What we do know with more confidence is that the word berserker itself likely derives from the Old Norse term for bear shirt, suggesting these warriors may have worn animal pelts, bear or wolf skins specifically, into battle, either as genuine protective clothing or as a symbolic, ritualistic attempt to take on the ferocity and spirit of the animal itself, a practice with parallels found across numerous ancient warrior cultures worldwide. Whatever the precise cause, later Viking Age Christian rulers eventually grew uncomfortable enough with berserkers that Norwegian law under King Eric Bloodaxe formally outlawed the practice entirely sometime in the mid-10th century, suggesting that whatever these warriors were actually doing before battle, it had become disruptive enough to organise society that the government of the time decided the whole thing needed to simply, officially, stop. Let's discuss the mystery of Viking navigation, and specifically how these seafarers managed to cross entire oceans, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the coast of North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus, using nothing more advanced than open wooden ships, with no compass, no sextant, and frequently no visible landmarks whatsoever for days or even weeks at a time. Norse sagas repeatedly mention a mysterious navigational tool called a sunstone, used to locate the sun's position even under thick cloud cover, or during the long, hazy twilight of northern latitudes, a claim that sounded for centuries suspiciously like folklore or literary invention, since no confirmed sunstone had ever actually been recovered from a genuine Viking archaeological site. The mystery took a genuinely fascinating turn when researchers began studying a specific type of naturally occurring crystal called Iceland spar, a form of calcite that exhibits a rare optical property called birefringence, splitting light into two separate beams as it passes through the crystal, creating a visible pattern that shifts depending on the polarization of incoming sunlight, allowing a sufficiently skilled navigator to determine the sun's exact position in the sky, even when it's completely hidden behind clouds or fog, simply by holding the crystal up and observing how the light splits and shifts. Laboratory experiments conducted by modern physicists have confirmed that this technique genuinely works, providing accurate directional information even in the notoriously overcast, fog-choked conditions common throughout the North Atlantic shipping routes Vikings regularly sailed. A genuine Iceland spar crystal was even recovered from a 16th century English shipwreck, considerably later than the Viking Age itself, but proving that sailors were indeed using this exact navigational technique for centuries, lending real, physical credibility to a tool that ancient sagas had been describing all along, one that sceptical modern historians had spent decades assuming was pure literary embellishment. Let's talk about a mystery that took genetic testing to finally crack, involving a Viking warrior grave excavated in Birka, Sweden, back in the 1880s, containing an impressively equipped burial, a sword, an axe, a spear, armour-piercing arrows, a battle knife, 2 shields, and, notably, a complete set of gaming pieces suggesting knowledge of military strategy, alongside the skeletal remains of 2 horses, everything you'd expect from the grave of a genuinely high-ranking respected military commander. For well over a century, archaeologists simply assumed, without much scrutiny, that these remains belonged to a man, since the elaborate weaponry seemed to obviously indicate a male warrior of considerable status and authority. Then, in 2017, a genuine DNA analysis was finally conducted on the skeletal remains, and the results, published in a major peer-reviewed archaeology journal, revealed something that upended decades of assumptions. The skeleton was definitively genetically female. This discovery sparked considerable debate throughout the archaeological community, with some researchers questioning whether the burial fully proved this individual had actually served as an active military commander in life, versus receiving these items purely as symbolic or ceremonial grave goods. But subsequent detailed analysis of the skeleton showed no evidence the remains had been mixed up or misattributed at any point, and further supported that this individual had likely lived an active, physically demanding life consistent with genuine martial training. The discovery has since fueled genuinely fascinating new discussions about the possible role of women in Viking Age warfare, complicating the traditionally accepted, almost exclusively male narrative of Viking military culture, and suggesting that at least some women may have held genuine positions of military authority and respect within Norse society, a detail that ancient sagas had actually hinted at all along. Describing shield maidens and female warriors in stories historians had long dismissed as purely mythological exaggeration, right up until actual physical genetic evidence arrived to quietly, definitively suggest otherwise. Now here's a mystery involving something considerably less dramatic than warfare. Viking hygiene, because contrary to the popular stereotype of dirty, unwashed barbaric raiders, archaeological evidence paints a genuinely surprising picture of a culture that valued personal grooming to a degree that actually startled and mildly scandalised their European contemporaries. Excavations of Viking Age settlements have consistently turned up combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, and razors in remarkable quantities, suggesting these tools were common, everyday possessions rather than rare luxury items reserved for the wealthy few. An Anglo-Saxon monk named John of Wallingford, writing several generations after the peak of Viking raids on England, recorded with what reads like genuine, slightly bitter exasperation that Danish settlers had become alarmingly popular with local English women specifically, because these Norsemen insisted on bathing every single Saturday, combing their hair regularly, and generally maintaining a level of personal cleanliness that put the local Anglo-Saxon men, by his own admission, to considerable shame. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains from Viking Age burial sites have also found evidence that many individuals maintained relatively good dental health for the era. likely a result of a diet lower in the processed sugars that would plague later medieval populations, combined with this apparent cultural emphasis on regular personal grooming. It's a genuinely amusing historical irony that the culture most famous in popular imagination for wild, unwashed, barbaric raiding was, according to their own victims' written complaints, actually out here weekly bathing, combing their hair, cleaning their ears, and generally showing up considerably better groomed than the very people writing frightened accounts of their raids. Let's discuss the mystery of Viking Age Norse settlements in North America, because for centuries, the idea that Vikings reached the shores of the Americas nearly 500 years before Columbus was treated by most mainstream historians as unreliable saga legend. Colourful storytelling rather than verified historical fact. That changed dramatically in 1960, when Norwegian explorer Helga Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Steen Ingstad, following clues embedded in Icelandic sagas describing a place called Vinland, discovered genuine Norse building remains at a site called Lonso Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, providing the first confirmed physical archaeological evidence of Norse presence in North America. Excavations revealed the remains of several sod-walled buildings constructed in a distinctly Norse architectural style, along with iron rivets and a stone spindle whorl used for spinning thread, an item strongly associated with the presence of women, alongside evidence of ironworking on site, confirming this wasn't simply a temporary raiding camp, but a genuine, if likely small and short-lived settlement. Radiocarbon dating, and, more recently, a remarkably precise dendrochronological analysis of a solar storm event recorded in ancient tree rings has allowed researchers to pinpoint the settlement's occupation to the exact year 1021 AD, making it, as of current evidence, the earliest confirmed date of any European presence anywhere in the Americas. The sagas themselves describe conflict with indigenous peoples the Norse settlers called Skraelings, along with mentions of a mysterious, much larger region called Vinland, meaning wine land, supposedly located somewhere further south, where wild grapes reportedly grew in abundance, a location that, despite considerable searching, has never been definitively identified or confirmed archaeologically, meaning that somewhere along the eastern coast of North America there may still be additional, currently undiscovered evidence of Norse exploration, quietly waiting 1,000 years later for someone to finally stumble upon it. Let's talk about the mystery of Viking Age burial ships, and specifically why some of the most elaborate, well-preserved Viking ship burials ever discovered were found buried not with celebrated male warriors, but with women of apparently enormous social status. The Osberg ship, unearthed in Norway in 1901, remains one of the best preserved Viking Age artefacts ever discovered, an elaborately carved wooden longship buried as an enormous, extravagant burial mound, containing the remains of 2 women, one considerably older, one younger, surrounded by an almost overwhelming quantity of grave goods, sledges, a beautifully carved wooden cart, textiles, kitchen equipment, and the remains of over a dozen sacrificed horses. For decades, researchers debated the identity of the older woman in particular, with some scholars speculating she may have been a queen, others suggesting she held a position as a powerful Velva, a Norse seeress or religious practitioner believed to hold genuine spiritual authority within Viking society. Isotope analysis conducted on her remains revealed she likely wasn't originally from the immediate region at all, suggesting she may have arrived through marriage, diplomatic alliance, or possibly captivity from a considerable distance away, adding another layer to an already genuinely unresolved mystery. What the burial does confirm, regardless of her exact specific identity, is that at least some Viking Age women held tremendous social status and respect, status significant enough to warrant one of the single most elaborate, resource-intensive burial ceremonies ever documented from the entire Viking Age, complete with an entire ship, an enormous burial mound, and more sacrificed livestock than most male chieftain burials from the same era ever received. Here's a genuinely eerie mystery involving Viking runestones, specifically a cluster of memorial stones found across Sweden that share startlingly similar carved inscriptions, all referencing men who travelled east and reportedly died somewhere along a river route deep in what is now Russia or Ukraine, part of the extensive Viking trade and raiding networks that stretched far beyond the popular image of raids purely on Western Europe, reaching all the way to Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire through an extensive river trading system historians now call the Volga trade route. One particularly notable runestone, known as the Ingvar Stones, references a disastrous large-scale eastern expedition led by a Swedish nobleman named Ingvar the Far-Travelled sometime around 1041, an expedition so catastrophic that historians estimate it may have resulted in the deaths of a significant portion of an entire generation of young Swedish men, based on the sheer number of memorial stones raised across Sweden, referencing lost relatives from this specific journey. The exact cause of the expedition's failure remains genuinely uncertain, with theories ranging from disease outbreak to military defeat to simple logistical catastrophe in unfamiliar, difficult terrain deep in foreign territory. But the sheer volume of surviving memorial stones, each representing a family grieving a son, husband or brother who never returned home, offers a genuinely moving physical record of a tragedy that ancient written chronicles barely mention at all, preserved instead almost entirely through the quiet, patient stonework of grieving families, standing in Swedish fields for nearly 1,000 years, still telling their story to anyone who takes the time to actually read them. Let's discuss the mystery of Viking Age human sacrifice, a genuinely uncomfortable topic that has been documented through a remarkable, detailed first-hand account written by an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who travelled through Viking territory along the Volga River in the early 10th century and personally witnessed and recorded in considerable detail the elaborate funeral of a Norse chieftain, including the ritual sacrifice of a slave woman who volunteered to accompany her master into the afterlife. An account so vivid and specific that historians have relied on it for centuries as one of the only detailed outsider descriptions of genuine Viking funeral customs. Ibn Fadlan's account describes an elaborate multi-day ceremony involving the construction of a ship, the ritual sacrifice of animals, and the slave woman being given intoxicating drinks, engaging in ritual sexual acts, and singing before ultimately being ceremonially killed and placed alongside her master's body, after which the entire ship was set ablaze in a massive funeral pyre witnessed by the assembled community. For a long time, some historians questioned whether this account might be exaggerated or embellished for a foreign audience, but archaeological evidence, including burial sites containing what appear to be additional bodies, buried alongside primary high-status individuals under circumstances suggesting they weren't natural deaths, has lent considerable credibility to at least some version of these practices genuinely occurring, at least among certain elite Viking Age burials, though the frequency and universality of the practice across the broader Norse world remains genuinely debated since Ibn Fadlan witnessed one specific funeral among one specific group, and historians remain understandably cautious about extrapolating his detailed but singular account into a universal claim about all Viking Age funerary practices everywhere. Let's talk about something considerably less grim, the mystery of Viking board games, because archaeologists have discovered evidence throughout Scandinavia of a popular Norse strategy game called Hnefatafl, sometimes called Viking chess, though the comparison is somewhat imprecise, since the game actually predates the introduction of chess to Scandinavia and involves a distinctly asymmetrical setup, with one player controlling a king and a small defending force positioned in the centre of the board, attempting to escape to any corner, while the opposing player controls a considerably larger attacking force, trying to surround and capture the king before he can break free. For centuries, the exact rules of Hnefatafl were genuinely lost, since while numerous game boards and playing pieces have survived in burial sites and settlement excavations, no complete written rulebook from the Viking Age itself survives, leaving modern historians to reconstruct the likely rules through a combination of archaeological evidence, references in surviving sagas, and comparison with similar, better documented games that survived in isolated regions like Sami communities in northern Scandinavia well into more recent centuries. Modern board game enthusiasts have since revived Hnefatafl, and it's developed a genuinely dedicated following among historical gaming communities, proving that a strategy game invented and enjoyed by Viking Age warriors during long, dark Scandinavian winters, likely played while feasting, drinking, and telling exactly the kind of exaggerated saga stories that eventually became historical sources for future generations, remains genuinely, surprisingly enjoyable to play, nearly 1,000 years after the last authentic Viking Age game board was carved. Let's finish this section with a mystery involving Viking Age glass beads, because chemical analysis of beads recovered from Scandinavian burial sites has revealed something genuinely surprising about just how far Viking trade networks actually extended, Several beads recovered from Viking Age sites in Sweden were found to contain a specific type of glass that chemical composition analysis traced directly back to India and Sri Lanka, meaning these small decorative objects had travelled an almost unimaginable distance, likely passing through numerous intermediary traders across the Middle East, Byzantine territory, and the extensive river trade networks Vikings maintained through Russia, before eventually ending up buried in a Scandinavian grave thousands of kilometres from their original point of manufacture. This discovery reinforces something modern historians have increasingly emphasised in recent decades, that the popular image of Vikings purely as violent raiders dramatically understates the sheer scale and sophistication of their genuine trading networks, which stretched from North America in the west to Central Asia, and possibly even further east, moving goods, currency, and cultural influence across a staggering geographic range for an era with no ships beyond wind-powered wooden longboats, and no communication faster than a determined messenger on horseback or by sea. The Vikings weren't simply raiders who occasionally happened to trade. For enormous portions of their society and enormous stretches of their history, they were fundamentally traders, explorers, and settlers first, with raiding representing just one, admittedly memorable chapter, within a considerably broader, considerably more complex story of a culture that managed to touch, trade with, and influence an almost unbelievable portion of the known medieval world. Let's talk about the mystery of Ragnar Lothbrok, one of the most famous names in all of Viking lore, thanks in large part to a certain very popular television series, and a figure whose actual historical existence remains genuinely, frustratingly uncertain, even after considerable scholarly effort to pin him down. According to the sagas, Ragnar was a legendary Norse king and raider, father to several genuinely historically documented sons, including Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironside, credited with raiding Paris, surviving a pit of venomous snakes, and eventually dying gruesomely in a snake pit in England after being captured by King Aelle of Northumbria, whose death was reportedly avenged by his sons through a ritual execution called the Blood Eagle, a punishment so gruesome that historians still debate whether it was ever literally performed or was purely symbolic literary invention meant to horrify medieval audiences. The genuine historical problem is that surviving accounts of Ragnar were written well over 2 centuries after he supposedly lived, compiled by Icelandic saga writers working from oral tradition that had already passed through many generations of storytellers, each one likely adding dramatic flourishes, combining separate historical figures into a single composite character, or outright inventing details to make for a more compelling story around the campfire. Most modern historians now believe Ragnar Lothbrok likely represents a legendary composite figure, an amalgamation of several genuine historical Viking raiders and leaders whose individual exploits gradually merged into one single, larger-than-life legendary character over generations of retelling, not unlike how certain figures in other oral storytelling traditions worldwide tend to absorb the accomplishments of several real people into one memorable mythologized name. His sons, by contrast, particularly Ivar the Boneless, do appear in considerably more reliable, closer to contemporary historical records documenting the great heathen army's invasion of England in 865, meaning that whatever the truth about Ragnar himself, his supposed sons were very likely genuine, historically documented Viking leaders, even if their legendary father may have been assembled piece by piece from the deeds of several different men. Let's discuss a genuinely strange mystery involving Viking Age skeletal remains, discovered with deliberately filed grooves across their front teeth, a practice archaeologists have found evidence of specifically among adult male skeletons in Viking Age Sweden and Denmark, with horizontal lines carefully filed into the enamel of the upper front teeth, sometimes multiple parallel grooves per tooth, a level of precision that would have required genuine skill and specialised tools to perform without simply shattering the tooth entirely. For years, researchers genuinely debated the purpose of this practice, since nothing in surviving written sources directly explains it. Current leading theories suggest these filed teeth may have served as a visible marker of status or group identity, possibly indicating membership among a specific merchant guild, warrior band, or trading network, since the practice appears concentrated among individuals also buried with items suggesting they were traders or warriors who travelled extensively, rather than distributed evenly across the general population. Some researchers have proposed the grooves may have been filled with a coloured pigment, making the marks even more visually striking and deliberately noticeable when the individual smiled or spoke. Essentially, an ancient, permanent form of body modification meant purely for visible display, not unlike modern tattoos or piercings serving as chosen markers of identity and belonging. Whatever the precise social meaning, the sheer deliberate care taken in creating these markings on living human teeth using nothing but hand tools suggests this wasn't some kind of casual practice, but a genuinely significant cultural ritual, one whose exact meaning, frustratingly, appears to have been lost entirely somewhere in the 1,000 years between when the last groove was carefully filed and when the first archaeologists finally noticed the pattern. Let's talk about the mystery of the Vikings' relationship with Islamic silver, because archaeologists excavating Viking Age hoards throughout Scandinavia have consistently uncovered enormous quantities of silver coins called dirhams, minted not in Scandinavia or even Western Europe, but throughout the Islamic Caliphate stretching from modern-day Iraq and Iran all the way to Central Asia, meaning these coins had travelled thousands of kilometres, likely through extensive river trade networks running through Russia, before ending up buried in the ground somewhere in rural Sweden or Denmark, sometimes in hoards containing literally tens of thousands of individual coins. One particularly massive hoard, discovered on the Swedish island of Gotland, contained over 14,000 silver coins, the overwhelming majority minted somewhere within the Islamic world, alongside silver jewellery and ingots, representing an almost staggering concentration of wealth deliberately buried in the ground and, for reasons historians can only speculate about, never retrieved by whoever originally hid it there. This pattern repeats across hundreds of similar hoards found throughout Scandinavia, painting a genuinely fascinating picture of Vikings functioning as a critical economic link connecting the Islamic world, Byzantine Constantinople, and Western Europe through an extensive trading network running along Russian rivers, exchanging furs, walrus ivory, amber, and enslaved captives for enormous quantities of Islamic silver, which then flowed back into Scandinavia in such volume that it fundamentally reshaped the entire Norse economy during the Viking Age. The exact reason so much of this silver ended up buried and never recovered remains genuinely debated, ranging from ritual offerings to the gods, to simple emergency wealth storage during times of conflict when the original owner was killed or displaced before ever returning to reclaim their carefully hidden fortune. Here's a mystery involving the famous Vinland map, a document that caused genuine excitement when it surfaced in the 1960s, purporting to be a 15th century map showing a landmass labelled Vinlanda Insula, positioned in the North Atlantic, seemingly confirming detailed medieval European knowledge of North America decades before Columbus's voyage, and sparking enormous scholarly interest and debate about its authenticity from the moment it was first revealed. If genuine, the map would represent extraordinary evidence that knowledge of Norse voyages to North America had spread considerably further through medieval Europe than historians previously believed. Unfortunately for map enthusiasts everywhere, decades of increasingly sophisticated forensic testing have gradually, and fairly conclusively, revealed the map to be a modern forgery. Chemical analysis of the ink revealed the presence of a synthetic compound called anatis, a specific form of titanium dioxide that wasn't commercially manufactured and available in this particular crystalline form until the 1920s, making its presence on a supposedly 15th century document a fairly enormous, glaring anachronism. Further testing published in 2021 using advanced spectral imaging techniques confirmed definitively that the ink contained modern titanium compounds throughout, essentially closing the case entirely. The map remains a genuinely fascinating object of study, not for what it reveals about actual Viking exploration, since we already have far more reliable archaeological evidence for that from Lonceau Meadows, but for what it reveals about 20th century forgery techniques and the enormous, enduring appetite among historians and the general public alike for tangible, dramatic proof of Norse voyages to the New World, an appetite apparently strong enough that someone was willing to go to considerable, sophisticated lengths to fabricate exactly that kind of evidence. Let's discuss the mystery of Viking Age textiles, and specifically a discovery that briefly caused enormous excitement throughout the archaeological world in 2013, when a Swedish researcher examining a Viking Age grave in Birka noticed woven patterns within recovered textile fragments that appeared to spell out the word Allah in Kufic Arabic script, suggesting a genuinely direct textile connection between Viking Age Sweden and the Islamic world, potentially indicating religious or cultural exchange far more intimate than simple trade in silver coins and goods. The discovery received enormous international media attention, generating headlines suggesting Vikings may have adopted or at least deeply respected aspects of Islamic religious culture. Subsequent, more rigorous scholarly analysis by other textile historians has since pushed back considerably on this initial interpretation, with several researchers arguing the pattern more likely represents a decorative geometric design, common in Central Asian textile traditions of the era, one that merely superficially resembles Arabic script when viewed from a certain angle, rather than a genuine, deliberate religious inscription. The debate remains genuinely unresolved within the academic community, illustrating a broader pattern we've seen repeatedly tonight, that even in an age of advanced chemical analysis, genetic testing, and high-resolution imaging, some Viking Age mysteries simply refuse to settle into a single, universally agreed-upon answer, leaving historians to keep arguing, respectfully but persistently, about exactly what a 1,000-year-old scrap of woven wool was actually trying to say. Let's talk about the mystery of Viking Age slavery, an uncomfortable but historically significant aspect of Norse society that popular culture frequently glosses over entirely in favour of more exciting raiding and exploration narratives. Thralls, as enslaved individuals were known in Old Norse society, represented a substantial portion of the Viking Age population, obtained both through raiding expeditions across Western Europe and through extensive trading networks stretching into Eastern Europe and beyond, with historians estimating enslaved people may have constituted as much as 10 to 20% of the total population in some Viking Age settlements, a genuinely enormous proportion for any historical society. Archaeological evidence for the practice includes iron slave collars recovered from several sites, along with mass graves showing signs of individuals who appear to have been executed alongside their owners, seemingly as part of funerary sacrifice practices, similar to what we discussed earlier through Ibn Fadlan's first-hand account. The Old Norse word for slave trading actually gives us a linguistic clue about the sheer scale of the practice, since historians believe the word Russ, from which the modern country name Russia ultimately derives, may originate from an Old Norse term related to rowing, referring to Scandinavian traders who rowed extensively along Russian rivers, in no small part specifically to capture and transport enslaved people from Slavic populations toward markets in Constantinople and the Islamic world, exchanging human beings for the very silver dirhams we discussed a moment ago. It's a genuinely sobering thread running through what otherwise sounds like an impressively cosmopolitan, far-reaching trade network, a reminder that the same extensive Viking connections that brought exotic silver, glass beads, and silk into Scandinavia were, quite often, built directly on top of a thriving, deeply institutionalized trade in enslaved human beings. Let's finish this section with something considerably gentler, the mystery of Viking Age music. Because while no complete written musical notation survives from the era, since music was passed down orally rather than written, archaeologists have recovered several genuine musical instruments from Viking Age sites, including bone flutes, simple stringed instruments called lyres, and various types of horns, giving researchers physical evidence to work from even without surviving sheet music to tell them exactly what tunes were actually played. A remarkably well-preserved lyre was recovered from a grave in Trossingen, Germany, dating to the Viking Age, allowing luthiers and musicologists to construct working replicas and begin experimenting with what authentic Norse music might have actually sounded like. Modern experimental archaeologists and musicians have used these physical replicas, combined with references to music and singing scattered throughout surviving sagas, to attempt reconstructing what Viking Age gatherings might have genuinely sounded like. Low, resonant, rhythmic melodies, likely accompanying storytelling, feasting, and long winter evenings spent indoors while storms raged outside. We'll never know with absolute certainty exactly what specific songs Viking Age families hummed while working, or which particular melodies warriors sang before setting out on a long sea voyage, but the physical instruments themselves, patiently recovered from graves and settlements across Scandinavia, confirm that music was a genuine, valued part of daily Norse life, not merely warfare and raiding, but quiet evenings, familiar tunes, and the simple, universal human comfort of sound and rhythm shared around a fire. Let's talk about the mystery of the Great Heathen Army's winter camps, because for a long time, historians had only written chronicle references describing a massive Viking force that invaded England in 865, wintering at various locations while conducting a sustained multi-year military campaign that eventually conquered several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The actual physical location and scale of these winter camps remained largely unknown until metal detector enthusiasts, working with professional archaeologists at a site called Torksey in Lincolnshire, began uncovering an absolutely staggering quantity of Viking Age artefacts scattered across the surrounding fields: coins, weights, fragments of silver hack metal, gaming pieces and dress pins, eventually suggesting a winter camp considerably larger and more organised than historians had previously imagined possible. Analysis of the site suggests the camp may have housed several thousand people during the winter of 872 to 873, functioning less like a temporary military bivouac and more like an entire, if temporary, functioning town, complete with evidence of craft production, trading activity, and even entertainment in the form of gaming pieces, suggesting the Viking army wasn't simply sitting idle waiting for spring, but actively running a genuine seasonal economy, complete with merchants, craftspeople, and presumably a considerable number of camp followers beyond the warriors themselves. This discovery fundamentally reshaped historians' understanding of just how organised and how logistically sophisticated these supposedly chaotic barbarian raiding forces genuinely were, capable of sustaining thousands of people through an entire English winter in hostile foreign territory through careful planning, active trading, and evidently enough downtime to sit around playing board games while waiting for the campaigning season to resume. Let's discuss the mystery of Viking Age medicine, because contrary to assumptions that Norse healing practices were purely superstitious, archaeological evidence combined with skeletal analysis has revealed a surprisingly practical, occasionally quite advanced approach to treating injury and illness. Excavated skeletal remains show clear evidence of successful surgical interventions, including trepanation, a procedure involving deliberately drilling or scraping a hole into the skull, which sounds genuinely alarming but was actually performed with enough surviving patients showing clear bone healing around the surgical site to confirm many individuals genuinely survived the procedure, sometimes by years or even decades afterward. Viking Age medical practitioners, often specific individuals within a community who had developed genuine specialised knowledge, treated wounds using cleaning techniques involving boiled herbal preparations with actual antiseptic properties, and archaeological evidence from sites including a Viking Age medical kit discovered in Denmark shows evidence of specialised tools resembling tweezers, small scalpels and probes, suggesting a level of practical medical sophistication considerably beyond simple folk superstition. Norse sagas also reference a specific, genuinely clever diagnostic technique for determining whether a stomach wound was fatal, feeding the wounded warrior a broth made with strong-smelling herbs like onion or leek, and then checking whether the smell could be detected seeping from the wound itself, which, if true, would indicate the intestines had been punctured. A genuinely resourceful, low-technology diagnostic method for determining wound severity in an era centuries before X-rays or any form of internal medical imaging existed. Let's talk about the mystery of the Jelling stones, two enormous carved runestones located in Denmark, commissioned by King Harald Bluetooth in the 10th century, that together represent one of the most significant surviving monuments from the entire Viking Age, often described by historians as Denmark's birth certificate, since the larger stone's inscription explicitly proclaims Harald's unification of Denmark under a single crown, and formally announces the kingdom's conversion to Christianity, marking a genuinely pivotal transitional moment as Viking Age Scandinavia gradually shifted away from its traditional Norse religious practices. For years, the stones were assumed to have originally been painted in bright, vivid colours, based on faint traces of pigment detected during various examinations, but the exact original colour scheme remained genuinely uncertain until modern researchers employed advanced multispectral imaging technology, capable of detecting mineral pigment traces invisible to the naked eye after 1,000 years of weathering had worn them away. This technology revealed the stones were indeed originally painted in vivid reds, blues, and blacks, a far cry from the plain, weathered grey stone visitors see today, meaning this monument, intended to make an enormous, unmistakable political and religious statement, would have appeared genuinely striking and vibrant when first erected, rather than the sombre, ancient grey relic it's become after 1,000 years of Scandinavian wind and rain, patiently, slowly washing the original colour away. Here's a fun mystery involving Viking ships and just how remarkably seaworthy their design actually was, because for a long time, sceptical historians questioned whether the relatively shallow, Open Viking longships described in sagas could genuinely have survived open ocean crossings to Iceland, Greenland and beyond, without capsizing in the notoriously rough North Atlantic swells. This scepticism was largely resolved when, in 1893, a full-sized, historically accurate replica of the Gokstad ship, an actual excavated Viking Age vessel, was built and successfully sailed across the entire Atlantic Ocean, from Norway to America in just 28 days, a genuinely remarkable feat proving definitively that these ships were far more seaworthy than many 19th century naval experts had initially assumed possible. The secret, marine archaeologists eventually determined, lay largely in the ship's remarkably flexible hull construction, built using overlapping wooden planks in a technique called clinker building, combined with a keel and hull design that allowed the entire vessel to genuinely flex and twist with ocean waves rather than rigidly resisting them, absorbing the energy of rough seas in a way that considerably reduced structural stress compared to more rigid ship designs used by other cultures during the same era. Modern engineers studying these replica voyages have noted that Viking shipbuilders, again without any formal understanding of modern material science or fluid dynamics, had essentially arrived at genuinely sophisticated engineering solutions purely through generations of accumulated practical experience and careful trial and error, building vessels flexible enough to survive conditions that would have shattered a more rigidly constructed ship, allowing small crews in open wooden boats to reliably cross an ocean that would remain genuinely intimidating even to considerably larger, more heavily built ships for centuries afterward. Let's finish with the mystery of Yggdrasil and Norse cosmology's surprisingly sophisticated understanding of interconnected worlds, because while obviously mythological rather than literal science, the Norse concept of 9 interconnected realms, all supported by the roots and branches of an enormous cosmic tree, reveals a genuinely thoughtful, structured attempt to explain the relationship between different aspects of existence, gods, giants, humans, the dead, and various other beings, all connected through and dependent upon the same central living structure. Archaeologists and historians studying surviving Norse religious practice have found genuine physical evidence of ritual sites built around specific significant trees, along with offerings deliberately placed near sacred groves, suggesting this cosmological belief wasn't purely abstract poetic metaphor confined to storytelling, but something that directly shaped how ordinary Viking Age people interacted with and understood the actual physical landscape around them. Modern scholars studying surviving fragments of Norse mythology, preserved primarily through later Icelandic manuscripts written down after Christianity had already begun replacing traditional Norse religious practice, continue to debate exactly how literally ordinary Viking Age farmers and traders actually understood these cosmological concepts in their daily lives, versus how much of the elaborate detail we know today reflects later poetic embellishment added by Christian-era writers recording rapidly fading oral traditions before they disappeared entirely. What remains clear is that this was a genuinely complex, carefully considered belief system, not the simple, cartoonish, barbarian mysticism popular culture sometimes reduces it to, but a thoughtful attempt by an entire culture to make sense of existence, mortality, and their own place within a vast interconnected cosmic structure, one root and branch at a time. Let's talk about the mystery of the Lewis chessman, an extraordinary collection of ornately carved walrus ivory and whale tooth, chess pieces discovered in 1831 on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, dating to the 12th century, technically just after the traditional Viking Age itself, but crafted using distinctly Norse artistic style, likely in Norway, during a period when Scotland's Western Isles remained under considerable Scandinavian cultural influence and control. The pieces, particularly the wide-eyed, comically anxious-looking rooks depicted as berserker warriors biting their own shields, have become genuinely iconic pieces of medieval art, instantly recognisable even to people with no particular interest in chess or Viking history. For nearly 2 centuries, the exact circumstances of how an elaborate, valuable set of chess pieces ended up buried on a remote Scottish beach remained genuinely mysterious, with theories ranging from a shipwrecked merchant losing his cargo to a wealthy owner deliberately hiding the pieces during some kind of conflict or emergency, intending to return for them later. The mystery deepened further when researchers realised the full set actually comprises pieces from at least 4 incomplete separate chess sets, suggesting these weren't simply one merchant's inventory, but possibly a merchant's broader stock in trade, carrying multiple sets intended for sale to wealthy clients throughout the region. In a genuinely exciting recent development, one previously unidentified piece from the same original hoard, a warrior long mistakenly catalogued and stored simply as an unidentified ivory antique, was rediscovered sitting quietly in a family's drawer in Edinburgh in 2019, having been purchased by their antique dealer grandfather back in 1964 for just £5, and was subsequently sold at auction for over £700,000 once its true identity as a genuine Lewis chessman was finally confirmed, proving that sometimes the most significant Viking Age mysteries aren't buried in ancient soil at all, but sitting patiently in someone's living room drawer, waiting nearly 60 years for anyone to actually look closely enough to recognise what they genuinely had. Let's discuss one final mystery involving the actual end of the Viking Age itself, and the surprisingly specific, well-documented event historians typically point to as its symbolic conclusion, the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, where the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, sometimes called the Last Great Viking, was killed attempting to invade England, in a battle that occurred mere weeks before the far more famous Battle of Hastings that would establish Norman rule over England entirely. According to the more colourful saga accounts, a single unnamed Norwegian warrior, positioned alone on a narrow bridge, reportedly held off the entire advancing English army by himself for a genuinely remarkable length of time, killing dozens of soldiers attempting to cross before finally being defeated when an English soldier floated underneath the bridge in a small boat and speared him from below, through a gap in the wooden planking. Whether this specific dramatic detail is genuine historical fact or later saga embellishment remains, like so much else we've discussed tonight, genuinely uncertain, but the broader battle itself is well documented, and Harald Hardrada's death is widely regarded by historians as marking a symbolic close to the traditional Viking Age of large-scale Scandinavian raiding and conquest throughout Western Europe. Within just a few short generations afterward, Scandinavian kingdoms had largely converted to Christianity, formalised more centralised governmental structures similar to their European neighbours, and gradually transitioned away from the raiding culture that had defined the previous 2.5 centuries, closing one of history's genuinely most transformative, most misunderstood chapters, one that turns out, after all this careful modern investigation, to have been considerably less about mindless horned-helmeted barbarism, and considerably more about ambitious explorers, resourceful traders, skilled craftspeople, and remarkably well-groomed seafarers who simply happened to be very, very good at sailing. Let's talk about the mystery of Viking Age houses, and specifically how genuinely comfortable, or genuinely uncomfortable, everyday domestic life actually was for ordinary Norse families, since popular imagination tends to focus almost entirely on ships, weapons, and raids, while giving very little thought to what people actually did during the long, dark months when they weren't off exploring or fighting. Archaeological excavations of Viking Age longhouses reveal single, large communal buildings, sometimes housing an entire extended family alongside their livestock during the coldest winter months, with a long central hearth providing both heat and light, and turf or wattle and daub walls providing genuinely effective insulation against brutal Scandinavian winters. Excavated hearths show evidence of communal cooking, and preserved food remains, including grains, dried fish, and preserved meat, suggest a diet considerably more varied and nutritionally balanced than the simple, meagre peasant fare popular imagination often assumes. Sleeping arrangements typically involved raised wooden platforms along the interior walls, covered with straw or fur bedding, and archaeologists have found evidence suggesting families organised their limited living space with genuine thoughtfulness, separate areas for cooking, sleeping, storage, and craft work, all carefully arranged within what was often, by modern standards, a genuinely small, single shared room. It's a picture considerably cosier, and considerably more domestically organised than the wild, chaotic barbarian encampments popular culture often imagines, closer, in many ways, to any other pre-industrial farming family anywhere in medieval Europe, just with slightly better navigational tools, considerably more elaborate jewellery, and evidently a noticeably higher standard of personal hygiene than their immediate neighbours. Let's discuss one more genuinely charming mystery, involving Viking Age toys, because excavations of settlements throughout Scandinavia have recovered small carved wooden boats, miniature weapons and simple dolls, clearly designed for children, offering a rare, genuinely touching glimpse into ordinary Viking Age family life beyond the raiding and trading that dominates most historical accounts. One particularly well-preserved wooden toy horse, complete with wheels allowing it to be pulled along by a length of cord, was recovered from a settlement in Norway, showing clear signs of wear consistent with genuine repeated childhood play, rather than purely ceremonial or symbolic use. These small, quiet discoveries matter more than their size might suggest, because they represent something historians sometimes struggle to capture through weapons, coins, and elaborate burial goods alone: the genuinely ordinary universal experience of Viking Age childhood, children learning to walk while pulling a wooden horse across a dirt floor, exactly the way children everywhere, in every era, have always found comfort and joy in small toys and simple games. It's easy, wandering through stories of raids, conquests, and elaborate ship burials, to forget that Viking Age society was, underneath all the drama, made up of entirely ordinary families, parents worrying about their children, children playing with toy horses by the fire, and grandparents telling stories that would, centuries later, eventually become the very sagas historians still study today, trying patiently, carefully to piece together exactly what everyday life actually felt like 1,000 years ago, in the quiet, ordinary moments between all the raiding and exploring that made the history books. Think about that for a moment, as your own thoughts begin drifting soft and slow tonight. Every mystery we've wandered through, the sunstone that lets sailors navigate through fog, the warrior grave that turned out to belong to a woman, the silver that travelled thousands of kilometres from lands the Vikings had never even seen firsthand, eventually revealed a culture far more thoughtful, far more far-reaching, and far more human than the simple raiding stereotype ever allowed. They combed their hair, they played board games by the fire, they buried their dead with the things that mattered to them: ships and horses and elaborate carved carts, hoping, the same way people everywhere always have, that something of who they were might carry forward into whatever came next. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey through the Viking Age, a culture that turns out to have been solving its own mysteries all along through patient craftsmanship, genuine navigational ingenuity, and an impressively extensive trading network that stretched across continents most of us would need a modern airplane to cross today. No horned helmets, no purely mindless barbarian raiding, just remarkably resourceful, remarkably well-groomed people sailing further, trading wider, and living considerably more complicated lives than 1,000 years of simplified popular imagination ever gave them proper credit for. Let your eyes close now if they haven't already. Let the weight of the day settle into whatever is holding you up. There's nowhere else you need to be tonight. Somewhere along the cold, quiet coastline of Scandinavia, the same dark northern waters that once carried longships toward Iceland, Greenland, and the far edge of a continent nobody in Europe yet knew existed, are still moving tonight, slow and steady, the way they always have. Let your own thoughts drift along with them now, unhurried, wide and dark and calm, carrying you gently, patiently, all the way down into rest. Rest easy tonight, and I'll see you in the next one.